Dantes moved through the corridors at his usual pace, careful not to tip off the two elves trailing behind him. He'd known they were tracking him since the moment he left the Undermarket, and he had no intention of letting them know that. Instead, he played along. With a silent command, roaches scurried across their path, their chittering legs tapping against the stone. A few more crawled up the walls and let themselves drop onto the elves. The older elf remained eerily calm, his face unreadable. The younger one? He cursed under his breath, barely suppressing his jumps at every little skittering sound. Weak, Dantes pressed forward, leading them straight into his garden. Upon arrival, he drew Riavare's rapier and, with a flick of his wrist, speared a ripe apple from one of the trees. He took a bite, letting the thick juice drip down his chin like spilled blood. Then, he reached out with his senses. The garden responded instantly, its hunger rippling through him. The peach tree at the entrance, the sprigs of grapevine creeping across the ground, the twisting roots expanding outward, all of them craved his blood. He met that hunger with a single, wordless reply. Okay, the ambush. The elves stepped into the garden, their weapons drawn. They were bold, but their confidence wavered when they saw Dantes waiting for them, eating an apple skewered on the blade of their former leader's sword. Dantes swallowed. Welcome. The elves said nothing. They spread out slightly, their footsteps cautious as their eyes darted around the chamber. Dantes could feel their amazement, even as they tried to hide it. He could sense every step they took, every time their boots brushed against a vine or a tree root. He began tightening his will. Grimald sent you to find the source of the fruit, I assume. They remained silent, but exchanged a quick glance. Good. They were separating, likely to position themselves for an attack. Dantes smiled. Come on. No need for this to be violent. We can talk. He flicked his wrist, knocking what remained of the apple's core off the rapier. Even if you do decide to kill me, wouldn't it be better to get some answers first? As he spoke, rats and roaches moved into position. He barely needed to focus on it. Lying, scheming, and bullshitting, that was second nature. The older elf was the first to break the silence. Ow! His hand reached for a tree trunk, almost unconsciously. Dantes smirked. I developed a new set of skills not long after Riavare decided to have me killed. Not sure of all the details, but from what I understand, I'm a druid. The older elf's eyes widened. A druid? Here. The younger elf frowned. What's a druid? His companion shook his head, running a scarred finger down his face. You grew up in the city. Makes sense you wouldn't know. Druids are blessed by the mother. They protect the wilds, forests, jungles, mountains. They're rare. In my homeland, there was only one. Dantes filed that information away. The younger elf scowled. Then why is there a druid here? The older one looked at Dantes, clearly wondering the same. Dantes shrugged. Fuck if I know. But here I am. Even as he spoke, he kept his focus on them, measuring their reactions. Sure enough, his bait worked. Even knowing that, the older elf muttered, This garden. I've never heard of a druid with this kind of power. The one you knew couldn't do this? Dantes asked. The elf hesitated. He was a dwarf. My clan shunned him. Useless. Dantes sighed. So, I answered your question. Let me ask mine again. Did Grimald send you? Or is this some fresh attempt at revenge? The younger elf smirked. Yeah, he sent us. The revenge is just a bonus. Dantes nodded. Thank you. Then he grinned. Any chance you'd rather work for me instead? The offer wasn't genuine. He just wanted to keep them off balance. The older elf narrowed his eyes. In another life, perhaps. But after what you did to the kings? You must die. Dantes smiled. Everything was in place. He had bought all the time he needed. The older elf's expression shifted. His eyes flickered to the trees around them, and suddenly realization dawned. Wait, a druid in a garden. He turned toward the exit. We need to Leah. Then he saw them. An army of rats and roaches stood blocking the only way out. We need to kill him first. Too late. Dantes unleashed his will. The garden responded. Vines coiled around their ankles. Branches moved to block their path. Swarming rats and roaches lunged at them. The younger elf managed to leap onto a rock, avoiding the vines, but the older one wasn't so lucky. He hacked desperately, trying to free himself, but the vermin overwhelmed him. Roaches crawled across his eyes. The kill. The younger elf sprang at Dantes, dagger flashing. Dantes rolled to the side before he could land, keeping his rapier raised in defense. The elf charged again. Dantes was pushed onto the defensive, forced to parry and retreat. The elf was faster, more skilled. Dantes kept backing away. He threw a handful of roaches at his attacker's face. The elf flinched. Dantes took his chance. Vines lashed up, tangling his opponent's feet. The elf tripped. Dantes drove the rapier into his back. The older elf let out a furious cry. For one brief second, he broke free, rushing toward Dantes. Then, the garden swallowed him again. Vines, rats, roaches. Dantes walked toward him slowly, withdrawing the rapier from the corpse at his feet. The older elf was struggling, desperately clawing at the rats on his face. The vermin cleared a path for Dantes as he approached. He raised the rapier, readying his strike. You know, it's a shame it had to end like this. The elf glared at him. You both seemed level-headed. I'd trade some of my current allies for you in a heartbeat. He shrugged. Don't worry, though. I still have a use for you. He drove the rapier through the elf's chest. The elf shuddered, then went still. Dantes wiped the blade clean against a tree, then checked his rat mark and roach mark. Both had dropped significantly. Expected. Still, they were over halfway full, giving him some leeway. Dantes slid the rapier back into its sheath, then reached out to the garden. Rats, roaches, the meat is all yours. Just leave their right ears for me. He let his power wash over the trees, the vines, the roots. Garden, you crave blood? Gorge yourself. The vermin and the earth responded with enthusiasm. Dantes watched the corpse disposal with mild fascination. Rot and decay were nothing new to him, not in Midtown, and certainly not down in the pit. But watching it happen this quickly, driven by the frenzy of rats and roaches, while roots slithered into the bodies, digging into veins still slick with blood. That was new. The garden had feasted. When the vermin were finished, Dantes moved to the remains, prying off the right ears he'd ordered them to leave untouched. He placed them in a pouch. The corpses were little more than hollowed husks now. The roots and vines had spread through their flesh, crisscrossing their skeletons like veins. In the center of each body, the heart remained intact. For a moment, just a flicker, Dantes could have sworn he saw one beat. His breath hitched. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Nothing. I'm tired. Exercising his abilities, fighting, even with his increased strength and stamina, had drained him. He wasn't used to it. He reached out with his senses. A wave of satisfaction washed over him. The garden was content, more so than it had been in months. The vermin were full, bellies packed with warm flesh. His rat mark and roach mark had gained back some of the favor he'd burned in the fight. Not enough, but a start, a step toward escape. Dantes moved toward the younger elf's dagger and picked it up. It was high quality, even he could tell that much. The older elf's thin sword was just as fine, and he found a hidden dagger tucked into his clothing. He slipped the weapons into his belt and stretched. If the consortium wanted the source of the fruit this badly, that meant they needed it. And if they needed it, then he had leverage. It was time to make them an offer. He turned to leave the cavern, but Jacopo stirred, crawling through his jacket. What are you doing? Dantes asked. Getting a snack. Dantes narrowed his eyes as Jacopo poked his head into the pouch of elf ears. Those aren't to eat. They're for bargaining. Jacopo scurried up to his shoulder, looking unbothered. I assumed they were for me. Dantes sighed. It might undercut a dramatic gesture later, but I'll give them to you when I'm done. Jacopo considered that. Okay. He adjusted his position as Dantes squeezed through a narrow passageway. What are you bargaining for? My escape. Jacopo twitched his nose. Isn't that what the seed is for? The seed is just a possibility. A backup plan. It's high risk. It might get me out, but it doesn't guarantee I make it out alive. And elf ears do. Not the ears. What they represent. Dantes adjusted his grip on his stolen blades. The consortium has smuggled people out before, or so the rumors say. I'm going to make them an offer they can't ignore. Jacopo fell silent, long enough that Dantes thought the conversation was over. Then, what's it like? Dantes frowned. What? Above. Outside this place. What's it like? Dantes stopped walking. You don't know? Jacopo shook his head. I was born here. My grandmother came from a ship, but my parents were born in the pit. Dantes exhaled slowly. And there's no escape for rats? No small holes leading to the surface? There were, but something blocks them now. An invisible force. Dantes nodded. The same protection spell they'd put in place after Gideon Gallant's escape. He hadn't considered that it might have trapped rats too, but made sense. Let me try something. Dantes closed his eyes, reaching into their connection. He broadcast images. The darkened alleys of Midtown after a fresh rain. The spiral towers of the Academy, visible from miles away. The gleaming white streets of Uptown, pristine and perfect. The cracked cobblestone of Midtown, filled with broken men and false hope. The vast ruins of old districts, overgrown, filled with wild dogs and desperate tax evaders. The docks, alive with the shouts of sailors hauling cargo. And finally, the city skyline at night. Windows glowing orange with candlelight, or green with witch fire. The infinite possibilities of that view. By the time Dantes pulled away, he realized he was clenching his jaw. His hand shook. He wanted it back. He craved it. Jacopo nodded. Yes, I want to see all of that myself. He paused. I don't need an ear if keeping it will help you. Dantes smiled. I appreciate that. Gathering back up, Dantes walked past collared territory into the part of the pit where the smaller gangs gathered. The ones too impure for the racial gangs. Some had been thrown in together, entire crews from the surface who stuck together. Others had formed over time, pulling together for survival. They were as varied as the stones on a midtown street and constantly at war with each other. Every so often, the smaller gangs rallied together. But every time they were crushed. The elves, dwarves, orcs, consortium. None of them wanted a new power to rise. Dantes moved through the chaos. A few dice games. A brawl. A man with braided hair and coal-lined eyes. A group making stew, tossing in mushrooms, rat meat, and wild greens in an attempt to create something edible. They watched him pass, but no one moved against him. Better fed, better armed, and the rumors had already spread. They knew who he was. Dantes rounded a corner, stepping into a cul-de-sac of cells. It was prime real estate. Unlike the rest of the pit, it wasn't filthy. Drawings of nude elves, orcs, and gnomes were pinned to the walls. The smell was fresh, not rotting. Trash was contained, not scattered. A small fire burned at the center. Around it, he spotted Zach, Jason, and Jake. Jason was cooking, while the other two counted goods. Clearly, the small jobs and contacts Dantes had given them were paying off. He stepped into the light. You three come up with a new name yet? They jumped. Jason nearly spilled the pot. He was the first to recover. Dantes. No, we're still working on that. He fidgeted, then gestured with the pot. Would you like something to eat? Dantes smiled. He walked toward Zach and gave him a look. Zach shifted over, making space. Dantes sat. I could eat. Jason quickly divvied up portions into 3 bowls, eating from the pot himself. Jake leaned forward. Can I ask why you're here? More info on the changeling job. Dantes shook his head. He took a bowl, tearing a piece of bread in half. What I need from you is simple. He drew the weapons he...
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
The shadow cats eyed the weapons. Jason with curiosity, Jake with suspicion, and Zach with obvious desire. Dantes ate another spoonful of stew from his bowl. It was surprisingly good. Jason was a talented cook. He gestured to the weapons. Take whichever you want. They're elven make, good quality from what I can tell. Zach stood and took the long sword from the group of weapons with little hesitation. He gave it a few test swings, and Dantes could tell almost immediately that he actually knew what he was doing. He went into a stance and worked his way through a brief form with it, one that looked familiar to Dantes. You were a guard? He asked, surprised. Zach nodded. Well, I joined up for a job that Jake had come up with. Didn't work out of training, was good though. Dantes took another bite. He hadn't considered how they'd gotten thrown into the prison, and asking was taboo, but a job using a plan and a guard? That was ambitious. It made sense given how they'd approached him and handled the jobs had given them, though. What did you mean by backup? Asked Jake. I need to have a conversation with the consortium. I don't expect any actual trouble, but I feel it will help to have you at my back with fresh weapons. These in particular. Where did you get them? Asked Jake. Their owners tried to kill me. I killed them first. And why did they try to kill you? The consortium sent them to. Jason let out a whistle. And you want us to go with you to talk to them holding their weapons? That's a ballsy. What's the pay? Asked Jake. Dantes raised his eyebrows. The weapons are the pay. You know the value of steel down here. I think that's more than fair considering that all I need from you is to stand with me and look intimidating. Jake shot Jason a look, and Jason opened his mouth to speak. Well, do it, said Zach before Jason could say anything. Jason sighed. Yeah, well, do it. He paused for a moment and gestured to Dante's bowl. How is it? Very fucking good, actually. They made it to the undermarket without trouble. Their new weapons, numbers, and reputation kept the scavengers off their backs as they made their way through. The kobold and dwarf guard at the undermarket's entrance eyed them warily, but made no moves to stop them as they entered. Dantes made his way directly to the consortium's headquarters at the far end of the market. It was the largest actual structure, built against a far wall that Dantes had been told was linked to a small tunnel, which the halflings and gnomes went through to reach a number of chambers accessible only to themselves. Next to the front door, standing in a booth attached to the building, was a dark-haired gnome wearing spectacles, a simple black tunic, and a bored expression answering questions from a red-faced man regarding how he felt he was swindled and shouldn't owe the gambling debt he had. Well, if you take a look at this paper, you'll see the problem, said the gnome. I mean, I can't read, but I know my name when I see it. Added novel been at. And is this your signature? Asked the gnome, pointing at a line on the paper. The man bent closer to look at it, and the gnome grabbed the man's hair, yanked his head closer, and slit his throat with a thin knife before he could react. Then he pushed the man's head away. He stumbled backward, clutching his throat for a moment before collapsing into a gurgling heap. The gnome leaned back in his chair and yelled back into the building. Hey, Zek, gotta clean up here. You can keep whatever you find in his pockets. He wiped the blade of his knife on his sleeve and looked at Dantes. Ah, elf slayer and orc betrayer. How can I help you? Dantes stepped over the dying man and up to the counter, reaching into his jacket to pull the two right elf ears from it. He placed them on the counter. The gnome nodded. Ah, yes, we heard he might be visiting about that. He smirked at his joke and clapped twice. A half-dozen guards, for kobold and two dwarven, quickly surrounded him at the counter. Dantes smiled. That's not why I'm here. You should know by now I wouldn't attack from the front anyway. Oh no, you seem to be quite unpredictable to us. If an attack from the front was what we least expected, I could see you making the attempt. Fair enough. Dantes grabbed the ears and placed them back in his pocket, sending a thought to Jacopo that they were all his, and drawing stares from both the shadow cats and the consortium goons who couldn't understand why Head picked them back up after making the gesture. I'm not here to fight, though. I'm here to negotiate. I have something Grimald and the rest of you want. Since his attempt to get it by killing me and stealing didn't work, why don't we try things the hard way instead and make a deal? If you find this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen. Please report the infringement. The gnome smiled. This time it was genuine. Sounds reasonable enough. They'll have Grimald and the executive meet you inside. Dantes nodded. The executive was whoever the consortium's council had elected to make significant deals with gang heads. He hadn't expected that. It either meant they wanted access to his source that badly, which was possible considering even at that moment he had a rat defecating in their latest shipment of ale, or his reputation meant they felt he deserved it. Or both. There was no reason it couldn't be both. They were escorted inside to a bare room with a stone slab table in the center, a number of overly small chairs, and a small altar to the god of merchants. The altar held a scale with a gold piece on each side perfectly balanced, and a wrapped scroll below it. Dantes presumed the scroll was their yearly accounting, a typical offering to the god to show that gold has been flowing and goods delivered. He wasn't surprised to see it. None were so pious as prisoners that had been thrown down into the pit. Dantes sat in one of the gnome-sized chairs and balanced his feet on the table in a practiced pose meant to emanate confidence. The shadow cats stood behind him or leaned against the nearest wall, all doing their best to scowl intimidatingly and doing a relatively solid job of it. The door opened, and Grimold with his wisp of white hair stepped through. His face was calm, but his eyes were darting around as if his brain was rattling against the back of them with quick thoughts. As he sat opposite Dantes, a halfling walked through the door. Dantes had expected an old man, but instead a young halfling walked through with a mop of brown hair, a relaxed expression, and a large black ledger. Dantes stood and offered a hand to the halfling. Dantes, it's a pleasure. The executive took his hand. Rumpert Totsvagen at your service. The man's voice was perfectly measured and coldly friendly in a way that Dantes had only ever experienced when had been confronted while shoplifting from the nicer stores in Uptown. Dantes nodded at Grimold as he sat back down. Grimold, always good to see you. He gestured back to the shadow cats. Thank you so much for the elven weapons. It was a generous gift. Grimold's eye twitched. Don't mention it. Executive Rumpert gave Grimold a purely mechanical comforting pat on his shoulder, then looked to Dantes. So, I have heard that you want to bargain with us since Grimold's attempt to circumvent you in your trade of alcohol has failed. That's right. Well, we are prepared to allow you to beat him severely as an opener to negotiations. We are willing to provide both a cane and a post for your convenience. Grimold's face paled as the executive spoke, and he opened his mouth to object, but stopped himself at the last moment. Dantes smiled. I'm interested, but we can table that for now. Maybe circle back to it later. Ah, you prefer to do the real business first. I can appreciate that. Rumpert opened the heavy black tome and began making marks on a blank page in some kind of language or code that Dantes didn't recognize. So what is your offer? I can grant you complete control of my supply of fruit and willingly hand over all control of my portion of the alcohol trade to the Small Folk Consortium. There was coughing behind him as Jason was taken aback by his statement. The executive nodded. Interesting. That's a high-value proposition. We'll be willing to offer a sum of gold, or perhaps some high-value goods. For that price, we may even be able to acquire you a personal changeling to do with as you please. Dantes' mask of friendly confidence almost shifted to an expression of disgust at that last statement, but he held it together. A handsome set of offers, but not quite what I'm looking for. Rumpert nodded. Okay then. No reason to waste further time. Tell us what you want. I know that the consortium is able to smuggle people out of the underprison. I want out. Rumpert stopped making notes in his ledger and gently placed his pen next to the ledger. Surely you realize if we had a way out, we would simply use it ourselves? Dantes shook his head. No, the business you do here and the business you do with people above for the people here is too profitable. It avoids taxes, gives you access to a place to safely store illegal goods, and lets you keep your imprisoned people safe. Besides, I'm not claiming that you have a tunnel to the surface that you can just walk out of. I'm saying I know you can occasionally smuggle out individuals. Rumpert closed the ledger and looked up at Dantes. I'm afraid that's not something we can do for you, though I'm willing to hear other offers. Dantes shook his head. Come now. We both know that you only have my booze here now. It makes you a nice chunk of copper every day, and in the long term the gold you save without me involved is significant. My request is not unreasonable. Rumpert shook his head. You don't understand. We can get certain people out of the underprison, usually 1 or 2 per year, due to the high cost of the bribes involved and the logistical effort required. Your offer is a little low, but not unreasonable for the request you're making, and normally we could work to find a way to make up the difference. The issue is that we cannot do this for you. Me specifically? Yes. Why not? Dantes felt heat build in his face and fought the impulse to stand and slam his fists on the table as he asked the question. Rumpert sighed. As you mentioned earlier, we work with people on the surface as well as here in the prison to make things happen. Typically, families pay us to make sure their relatives are well supplied here and to transport messages. Other times, we are asked to kill a prisoner whose enemies can only reach him through us. In very unique cases, we are paid specifically to not do things for certain prisoners in order to make their lives harder. These are my favorite kinds of deals due to the high value and low effort involved. And someone paid you to not work with me? But I've been trading with you since I got here. Rumpert nodded. You were never forbidden from trading or working with us. But 2 years ago, we were paid specifically to never aid you in escaping and to not allow any communications to reach you. Who? Asked Dantes, clenching his fists with enough force that his nails began to dig into his palms and make them bleed. Let me check something. The executive reopened the ledger and scanned a few pages. Looks like he didn't pay to stay anonymous. He looked up at Dantes. It was a man named Mondego. Dantes could hear ringing in his ears, and his vision went red for a moment, but he let out a long, slow breath. And you can't be convinced to renege on this deal? Rumpert shook his head. I'm afraid not. It's fey-bound, witnessed by one of the hidden folk. If we broke it, we would be cursed. Dantes forced himself to open his hands and lay them flat on the table in front of him. Our deal regarding the sale of booze stays the same. He stood up and held out his hand, his palm dripping blood onto the table. Rumpert didn't hesitate to stand and shake it. Dantes started to roll up his sleeves, and when he was done, he pointed at Grimold. Let's circle back around to me, beating him. By the time Dantes was done, his hand was sore from the reverberation of the cane. He stopped just short of killing Grimold. He had a feeling that the executive would find some way to charge him for the death if he went too far. He tossed the cane to the side and stretched. A small crowd had gathered to see what was going on, and Rumpert had witnessed the beating himself, ledger in hand and cold smile still sitting on his face. Dantes held out his hand, and Jason handed him back his jacket, which he slipped back on. He gave Rumpert a curt nod. Good meeting. It was a pleasure. Dantes began walking, the small crowd that had gathered clearing a path for him as he moved. He felt a bit better. Getting a bit of satisfaction from beating Grimold had helped to clear the rage head felt building. Anger wouldn't help him, not if he wanted to get out. He had 2 paths left to him, but knowing his recent luck, he accepted with near certainty that the most dangerous path was the one he would need to take. He took his still bleeding palm and rested it on the Mother's Reach seed in his pocket, letting the blood seep out of him and into it. As he did so, he filled it with a bit of his will and a simple message. Hold. He felt the seed resist initially, but eventually comply as the life it pulsed began to speed up with the introduction of his blood. It wouldn't be smart to let it start growing in his jacket. Besides which, when he used it, had needed to grow quickly, and he had a feeling it would cost him heavily to make that happen. Better to start now. Otherwise, he'd be bleeding himself dry when he needed it. The shadow cats walked behind him, unsure if they should still be following him or not. They were enjoying the looks of fear and respect they received by being part of his posse, even if he was too far in his own mind to notice at the moment. They also had little idea that they shared that prodigious distinction with all of the rats and roaches within 100 yards. As they walked, they began exchanging glances. There were not specific words said, but a lifetime of friendship meant 1,000 things passed between them as they looked at one another. First, Jason looked to Jake with his eyes squinted. Jake gritted his teeth and slid his head from side to side, as if unsure. Zach looked at them both and made a gesture with both of his hands, indicating an affirmative of some kind. Dante stopped moving toward the exit to the undermarket and placed a hand on his face, taking a deep breath. Had been watching them, of course, through Jacopo's eyes, as well as a bird's-eye view from a few rats on nearby stall roofs. Do you 3 have something you want to mention, or are you just enjoying making stupid faces at one another? He tried to keep his tone affable. They'd not really done anything wrong, but the day had worn on him, so a harsh edge bled into his words. It didn't help that the 3 of them had the image of him caning Grimold so fresh in their minds. Jason stepped closer to Dantes at Jake and Zach's gesturing. No Mondego. You what? The entirety of Dante's focus snapped onto Jason, pulling sharply from every rat, roach, and weed nearby to concentrate like a beam on him. Jason could feel a physical pressure in Dante's look, but kept eye contact with him as he spoke, not wanting to appear weak to either him or his peers as they stood behind him. Well, not personally, but we know of him. He had become a big name before we got thrown down here. Had been a small-time ganger with Dantes when had been on the surface, and while had initially asked around the prison the first 2 years had been down, had never heard anything about him before. For him to afford the consortium's fee was no small thing, though Dantes was unsure of why he would bother. According to Rumpert, Mondego had paid to have him denied their escape services and messaging 2 years prior, far before Dantes could have been considered anything resembling a threat. The idea that he was just that afraid of him was a comforting one, though it seemed unrealistic if Mondego had amassed real power. It was also strange that he didn't simply hire someone to kill him. Tell me what you know. If you come across this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen from Royal Road. Please report it. Jason nodded. Well, he basically runs Midtown now. He and his wife Mercedes. Half the businesses pay protection up to him. The rest he has under his thumb hiding goods or moving product for him. He made peace with the smugglers at the docks, and he's got more than 100 working under him. And that was just the last time you heard about it. Interrupted Jake. He's probably got more people working for him now. Not to mention, I remember there being rumblings about the Five Fingers making him the sixth. Probably hasn't happened yet, though. Feel like we've heard something about it, even down here. Dantes frowned. Did you say his wife Mercedes? Yeah. Dantes shook his head slightly. That didn't surprise him. She'd always seemed to get a cheap thrill out of making Mondego jealous of them. He expected a touch more rage at hearing that they were together, but he didn't. In his mind, Shed moved on the moment he didn't hear from her while waiting in the jail to get thrown into the maw. This other betrayal was so minor that it barely warranted a response. His hate for her and Mondego was already as deep as it could go. Something wrong? Asked Jason. Dantes shook his head. No, just didn't think she was a marrying type. Do you know how he started moving up? Or who he might be working with? Jason shook his head. No, we mostly worked on the east side. This is just stuff we gleaned in the rumor mill. ID heard he got his start when he took down a councilman's shipment. Made off with a ton of dust and gold, said Zach. Dante's eye twitched, and he clenched his jaw. Where did you hear that? My old sergeant from when I was in the guard. He was a real go-getter, in charge of Midtown, and was crazy enough to actually try to arrest people sometimes. He grilled me when he heard I had a few contacts in the area. He told me a bit about it. So Mondego had just retried the same heist that had gotten Dantes thrown into the pit, but succeeded. He added that theft to the 5 years that had been stolen for him. What was his name? Pasha, I think. It's been a while, though. Dantes noted the name in his mind. If he was still assigned to Midtown, he may have information he could use. Anything else you all know about him? They exchanged glances and shrugs. No, said Jason. What about a man named Danglars? Or Gaspard? They exchanged glanced and shrugged for a second time. No, never heard of them. Dantes nodded. Either Mondego and Mercedes had done away with them too, or they were still just small-timers. If they were alive, he'd be paying them a visit. Does it matter if you know? Asked Jake, his expression thoughtful. It might. Jake nodded. It might because you may have another way out? Dantes smiled. What makes you think that? At it novel been at. Why else would any of this matter? Except to make yourself upset, and you don't seem the type to wallow. Dantes almost laughed. He'd already spent several years wallowing in fact, but they didn't need to know that. If I do have a way out, it would be a very dangerous thing, and also nowhere near ready yet. And if it became ready? Asked Jake. Then IDB letting the Shadow Cats know, as long as they change their name. They can work on that, said Jason. I still think Nightblades works, said Zach without a hint of shame. Dantes pursed his lip, holding back the initial response that began to rise from his throat. Keep working on it. Dantes took his leave of them and began walking the winding path back to his cave. It was a quiet walk now, without his garden yelling at him constantly for blood, and he was grateful for that. He needed time and space to think. His only remaining options were the seed, or finding some other way to convince guards to smuggle him out. The logistics of the latter were a nightmare, especially since he had no clue when they would take another visit into the pit. He felt Jacopo crawl from a pouch in the back of his jacket up to his shoulder. He sat there for a moment, still nibbling on an elf ear. It seems we will not see the city after all. Dantes shook his head. Oh, we will. We'll just have to get there the hard way. It seems it is always the hard way. It does, doesn't it? Dantes gently placed a small candle down on the floor of the wide cavern. He took out a small burned stick, lit it, and gently placed it against the wick of the candle. It lit easily, and then he moved a few yards down and lit another one. He repeated this process until there were a half-dozen candles lit in a long straight line. He reached out his senses, feeling all of the life in the wide cavern starting to stir from his activity. He focused his attention on the cave moths nearby, not willing them to do anything, but instead simply broadcasting the image of candlelight to them. He felt them respond shortly after, and soon enough there were dozens of moths fluttering around the candlelight, their soft gray forms getting closer and closer to the burning flames, a few of them coming to close and lighting themselves aflame. The moths weren't his goal. He couldn't really think of what he would do with a moth's favor, aside from maybe using them to destroy shipments of cloth coming in from the ports after purchasing a large amount and then selling what he stored at a high premium. He paused for a moment. That was actually a fantastic idea, but not one that would be of much use to him in the Underprison. His current needs were very different from what he hoped his future ones would be. He filed the idea away for later and focused on his actual target for the day, the bats hanging from the ceiling above. Enjoy the buffet. He couldn't see in the contrast between the candlelight and the dark, but he could hear the soft wing beats of the bats as they dropped from their upside-down perches and began to make their way toward the moths that had gathered to enjoy the light. It was mere seconds before he started to feel moths' lives start to be extinguished as the bats caught them in their talons and jaws. They didn't seem to mind, though, just continuing their mindless drifting toward the light. It had taken him some time to decide where to focus his attention in the last few weeks. Head continued his exercise, transporting the fruit, the occasional round of dice with the changelings or the collard. Head also continued to work on coordinating the rats and roaches simultaneously, but even that wasn't really enough to keep boredom from slipping through. So Head decided to see what he could do to gain another mark. Head considered spiders, snakes, and a few other critters, but found that it was too hard to locate large groups of them. And also the easiest ways to feed them and gain their favor would be to sacrifice his rats and roaches, which was counterproductive, so Head decided on bats. He was already starting to understand them better, catching the odd word here and there, even though he still couldn't directly speak to them. He left the candles burning in the cavern and made his way back to his own cave. He could feel his garden starting to ramp up its request for blood again, but so far the droplets of his own had kept the cries from growing too loud. He began to flit through the viewpoint of a number of rats, making sure that his path ahead was clear. Then he shifted to that of the roaches. It was harder to process what they were seeing and feeling for Dantes, but he could keep track of them from a much greater distance without issue and at far less of a cost. There seemed to be some kind of commotion with the collard, but he couldn't tell exactly what. He looked at his marks. The roach mark was full at both wings, with just the head still stubbornly black. The rat mark, on the other hand, was only a fingernail's width from being completely filled. He flexed his hand and clenched it into a fist, watching the nearly completely golden mark expand and contract on his skin. He was excited to see what would happen. He wasn't certain of what it would be, but he knew he wanted it. At it novel been at. He made it to his small territory in the Underprison without trouble and broadcast a message to all the nearby rats that they could eat all of the fruit they wanted to, aside from the peach tree, which was Jacopo's. The amount of favor Head been receiving got smaller as the mark filled, but he hoped one last push would get him where he wanted to be. He arrived at his cave, squeezing into it through the large crack that acted as a door. It had gotten tighter and tighter recently, and he found himself needing to really stretch at the middle portion to get through. The cost of having a full stomach regularly again. He moved over to his pantry and removed a bit of fruit, some dried meat Head gotten in the undermarket, and a piece of stale bread. A poor man's meal on the surface, but a rich man's meal in the pit. Stolen novel, please report. He walked across the thick carpet of green moss that spanned the entire cave and laid against a particularly thick patch of it in the corner, laying his food on the ground in front of himself after sending out a warning to scavengers to leave it alone until he was done. Jacopo leapt off of his shoulder and picked his own favorite things from the pantry: a pawful of dried meat, a peach from his tree, and a bit of hardtack. They ate in a comfortable silence for some time, until Dantes started to feel strange. It was minor at first, a bit of a burning and itching sensation on his wrist that he absently scratched at as he ate his food and let his senses wander through the lift that filled his cave. Then the pain increased. He looked at his wrist. The rat mark was full and glowing with golden light. All around it, his inner wrist was covered in thick gray hair. He stood, swallowing his food as he stared at the patch of hair. Even as he was looking at it, more hairs began to pop up on his arm, spreading out further and filling in thicker as it began to cover his arm. He opened his mouth to scream, but was winded as a heinously loud, cracking noise shot from his back followed my terrible pain as he was forced to lurch forward, landing on his hands and knees. He tried to scream again, but as he opened his mouth, his jaw made a terrible crunching noise as it began to elongate, his nose stretching out to meet it. He fell to his side and began tearing at his own skin in a mad frenzy of agony as whatever process his body was going through sped up. His already long fingers grew longer, his back began to arch further forward, and his joints all popped into and out of place as they rearranged him into a new shape. On top of that, those few moments in which he was able to recognize anything that wasn't pain, he could see the cave was expanding, growing larger and larger every moment. He believed, or hoped, that the pain would release him and he would pass out. But it was merciless, and he felt every individual change with pure consciousness and focus. The only thing that caused one pain to fade was the introduction of another. After what felt like an eternity, it came to an end, and he found himself standing. No, not standing, hunched over. He looked at his hands and saw a small, delicate paws looking back at him. He moved his attention across his body, taking a few steps, twitching his new whiskers, and swinging his thin tail back and forth. Head transformed into a rat. The feeling was familiar, thanks to his many experiences looking through the eyes of rats. But that didn't mean it was welcome. You're ugly as a rat. Are you considered ugly by 2 legs when you are one of them? Dantes turned around to look at Jacopo. It was very unusual to see him at eye level. They were the same size, give or take a whisker or two. Some do, certainly. His words came out as a series of squeaks, but at the same time were perfectly understandable to him. This doesn't surprise you? Jacopo shrugged. You were already an honorary rat to me, and at this point your surprises are no longer surprising. He looked down at his wrist. The rat and roach marks were both still there. He reached out with his senses and found that his abilities didn't seem diminished at all. The only real difference seemed to be that he had become a rat. He took a long, deep breath into his tiny lungs and willed himself to change back. It worked, as he instinctively knew it would, and he grew back to his human self without nearly as much pain as the initial transformation had taken. He took another breath and willed himself to change into a rat again. This time it was less painful and much faster, but still incredibly unpleasant. He repeated the process a few more times anyway, switching from rat to human, and back until he could perform the transformation within seconds either way. He couldn't think of many immediate possibilities for the power, at least none that it wouldn't make more sense for him to just send a rat to do, but the ability to get out of and into places personally was very useful to him. He looked back at his wrist. The rat mark's fangs were still filled with gold, which meant that the transformation didn't cost him any favor. He ran his finger along the raised skin of it. Thank you, rat god. He felt the mark burn for a moment, as if had been acknowledged, then it faded. He started going back through his regular rotation of rats and roaches to see if anything had changed. When he reached the roach he had been monitoring the collard, he froze. He sensed blood. Through the roach he could feel that a number of people were moving about, and sensed that there was a lot of blood and screaming. He attempted to move closer, but the movement of people was too dangerous, and when a roach's leg was crushed by a collard rushing by, he broke the connection. He needed to go there himself. He checked his kit and began moving through the tunnels to collared territory. He sent several rats ahead and tried to determine what was going on, but all he could really tell was that something had happened and several of the collared had been hurt. There was too much activity to read the situation beyond that. He ran through the tunnels, finding himself moving a bit more naturally through them than he had in the past. Head always had a talent for it, pathfinding and traveling through the pit's narrow and dangerous outskirts. But suddenly his movements were on an entirely different level. It was like something had clicked for him, like he could sense the edges of the tunnels and how they twisted and turned before he even reached them, even if Head not moved through them before. His body also seemed to be switching between crawling, running, sidling, and jumping with near-perfect fluidity. It reminded him of when he was riding in Jacopo's mind. He wondered if Head not fully completed his transformation back to human, or if by changing the once had been permanently changed somehow. He didn't feel any discomfort about the idea. He already lived in a hole in the ground and ate what some people would consider trash. As Jacopo had said, he was already an honorary rat, even before Head gained the ability to transform. He reached the entrance to collared territory more quickly than he ever had before, and saw that the entire entrance was blocked off by 6 of Merle's lieutenants wielding heavy clubs. A few of them jumped as he rounded the corner, but once they recognized him, they lowered their weapons. Dantes said, "Or bus," waving him through. "You all right? Did you run into any of them?" "Any of who?" He responded, walking between the burly guards to stand just within the collared chambers. "The orcs, they just attacked a few of our men that were transporting Mez's most recent delivery. Killed 3, maybe 4 depending on how Televor's doing. I didn't get a good look at him." Dantes felt his entire body tense. "Where's he?" "Merle's chamber, but..." Dantes pushed past him and started weaving through the fully mobilized collard. He saw a number of them wielding new knives or clubs, 3 with spears, several cleaning cloth for bandages in the fountain. It seemed like Merle had been taking advantage of the goods Head received from the consortium and using them to better equip his people. A very smart call, given everything that had been happening. Dantes didn't have time to fully process that, though, as he moved through the press of people up to Merle's cell outside of which stood 2 guards. One of them went to stop Dantes from entering, but the other stopped him and waved for Dantes to go on in, recognizing him. Dantes gave him a grateful nod and stepped inside. Merle was leaned against a wall on one side of the room. Pillion was pacing on the other side, and Wayne was kneeling by the bench that Tell had been laid on. Tell was pale. His shirt had been removed, and a large bandage was wrapped across his stomach where a patch of red was slowly spreading. The smell of blood and feces filled the air. Had smelled that after stabbing before. The blade had punctured his guts. Before Dantes could walk toward him, Pillion stepped into his way. "This is your fucking fault. If it wasn't for your stupid fucking booze deal and what you did to the orcs, this wouldn't have fucking happened." Pillion's pupils were enormous and black, and his hands were twitching as he spoke. He was high. Dantes knew the look well, had seen it in the mirror more than once. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. Dantes just nodded at him. "Yeah, it's my fault. Now get out of my way." Pillion's eye twitched, but he didn't blink. He was unsure of how to handle Dantes' admission of guilt, and so resumed his pacing. Dantes moved over to kneel across from where Wayne was. Telephone's eyes were closed, so he looked to Wayne. Wayne's eyes were wet with tears as their eyes met. He said there were about 10 of them. They didn't say anything, just started killing. Blood was there, leading the attack. Tell was the first to be stabbed, so they thought he was dead. They left him for the rats, and he stumbled here. Said he took some back passages he knew would lead back here because of something you told him before. Dantes nodded, barely hearing what Wayne was saying as he watched Telephone's chest rise and fall unsteadily. He called on his senses and tried to reach out to Tell in the same way he could reach out to Jacopo or any other living creature, but in return received only silence. He drew his attention away from every rat and roach Head been monitoring, even Jacopo, and focused all of his intent on Tell. Telephone's breathing seemed to speed up, but nothing changed, and still Dantes sensed only silence from him. Dantes slammed his fist on the ground. Damn it. Had tried to see if his abilities could affect people before, but it had never worked. He wasn't sure of what he expected. His powers had been intuitive to him up to this point, and had hoped that maybe if he reached out with them, some solution or ability would pop into his mind. But it was a waste of energy and attention. Had it novel been at. Dantes' telephone's eyes opened, and he looked around, his eyes finding Dantes. "I'm here, Tell. The orcs, they—" "Wayne told me. Guess they decided it wasn't worth killing you, huh?" Tell smiled weakly and winced. "Guess not." He took a breath. "You smell like shit." Dantes laughed. "I slipped in some on the way here," he lied. "Couldn't bother to scrape your boot on the way to see a dying man. Shameful. You'll be fine." Tell nodded. "Sure. We'll just get a priest lowered down here, and they'll have me up in no time." Wayne was just saying he's always been very tempted to worship the goddess of the healing touch. Wayne looked away for a moment to wipe his eyes. "No, I said I wouldn't mind an excuse to receive her disciples' touch myself." They all had a short laugh at that. Then Tell closed his eyes for a few moments before opening them again. "Dantes, I've been skimming some booze off the top to sell myself." "I'm sorry." Dantes nodded slowly. "They'll hold off on beating you until you're feeling better. At this point, I doubt you'd even feel it." Tell closed his eyes again, his breaths seeming to become more strained for a few moments. Dantes could see small beads of sweat beginning to form across his skin. "Merlin, are you there?" asked Tell. Merle took a few steps closer, his hulking figure looking oddly gentle as he bent over and placed a hand on Telephone's shoulder. "I'm here, lad. Give everything from my cell to these three, except the etchings. I want Sin to have them." "At the witch wench." Merle nodded. "They'll make sure of it." Telephone's face twitched for a moment, and somehow he summoned the strength to bring a hand up to his collar and yank at it with surprising force, his whole body shaking. "Gods, I just wish I could cast one more spell. Just one more time I want to feel it again. Just produce a mote of light, or hear the whisper of a succubus telling me of debauchery around the corner. To light a fucking candle." He let his hand fall back to his side. The sudden vigor had vanishing. "I could get used to everything else down here. The lack of light, the lack of women, all of it. There were ways to make do, to pretend like you had what you needed, but magic you can't pretend you still have that." Pillion had stopped his pacing and come to Telephone's side, his words breaking him from his tweaking. He, Wayne, and Merle all shared the same pained expression as Tell spoke. They knew exactly what he was talking about. Now that Dantes was looking at them, he noticed that just like Tell, their collars were scratched and torn at, and both Merle and Pillion even had scratch marks that had turned to scars just beneath the collars, peeking out. Even though they'd known that they wouldn't be able to remove them, they'd still tried, desperate to have their magic back. Telephone's eyes closed longer than the previous time, and his breathing grew more ragged before they opened again. "Tell Sin she was the best lay I've ever had." Dantes chuckled. "I will." He opened his eyes one final time, letting out a wheezing breath. "My parents, I'm sorry." His eyes closed and didn't open again. He kept breathing for another hour while everyone in the room sat in silence, Merle leaving only once to make sure there had been no more attacks on his people. They all watched him take his last breath, and then nothing. They all sat there in silence for some time. Then Dantes stood and began putting his hands under Telephone's body, attempting to lift him. "What are you doing?" asked Merle, though he didn't move to stop him. "I know a place where I can actually bury him. In real dirt. Unless you had other ideas? We usually cut their heads off so that the collar can be removed, then throw them to the rats. We carve their names into the collars and put them here." Merle moved to a corner of his cell where the wall was covered in a piece of fabric. He gently removed it, and behind were nearly 24 bronze collars, each of them with different names carved into them. Dantes nodded. "We'll bring back the collar." He looked at Wayne. "Come with me." Wayne was sitting with his head in his hands, but managed to raise it to look at Dantes with red eyes. "What?" "You'll need help with the body, and I don't trust anyone else. Come with me." Wayne looked into the middle distance for a moment and nodded. He moved over to the sheet that Merle had pulled aside and tore it down. Then he laid it over Telephone's corpse. He and Dantes wrapped the body, and Dantes lifted it by the feet, while Wayne lifted it by the head and shoulders. They began to walk out of the cell, but Pillion stopped them walking deliberately around Dantes to stand in front of Wayne. He reached into his pockets and pulled out 2 copper coins and held them out to Wayne. "Wherever you put him, bury him with these. It's what I owed him from the last time we rolled dice." Wayne nodded and pocketed the coins. They walked out of Merle's cell, and the commotion within the collared chambers began to quiet as everyone saw Telephone's corpse. As they moved, they saw furrowed brows, clenched fists, and eyes wide with fear. Tell had been a popular guy, quick with a joke or a smile, and nearly always willing to help out if someone needed it. On top of that, had been becoming more of an authority, almost on the level of Merle's lieutenants, due to his savvy use of his proximity to Dantes and his own growing skills at deal-making and skullduggery. Normally, Dantes would have been considering all of this, trying to think of how he could influence the situation, turn it to his favor, but his mind was occupied elsewhere. Rats and roaches were being gathered and spread throughout the tunnels toward orc territory and everywhere in between. As he and Wayne moved through the tunnels to his garden, he began tracking all of the members of the orc gang's movements. He already knew the layout of their territory from previous scouting missions, and he knew who among them were leaders, or if not leaders, fulcrums on which the gang rested. As he did that with a focus on rats, he let Jacopo work through him to control the roaches, letting him focus on tracking those orcs who were in the outskirts, hunting or raiding. Dantes had anticipated that Blood and his men would want revenge on him. Had even considered that they may target the Collard, but had dismissed it since the two gangs had no bad blood with each other in the past. There was a way that things usually developed in the pit in terms of violence between gangs. It started with a deal going wrong or an insult. Then it escalated into small-scale brawls. Then there was a death, and from there 2 paths emerged. In one, they would make peace with a third gang as the mediator, and in another it was all-out war. Dantes clenched his teeth. He should have predicted what the orcs were up to after their attack on the dwarves. They'd had bad blood already, but an escalation that quick should have already tipped him off that the orcs were willing to skip directly to cutting throats. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. He kept up the back and forth with himself the entire way through the tunnels to his garden, all while monitoring the path in front of and behind himself, moving the rats to track the orcs, and coordinating his plans with Jacopo. Wayne kept pace with him relatively easily. He was smaller than the average orc, but lifting and moving someone as light as Tell was no trouble for him. He didn't ask where they were going. His own mind was preoccupied in a much different way from Dantes. It wasn't until they reached the garden that his attention shifted. He nearly dropped Tell as they moved inside. The entire cavern was a sea of red leaves, sitting completely still in the windless underground. The smell of fresh vegetation and rotted fruit hit his nostrils at nearly the same moment the sight of the garden did, and he found himself so overwhelmed that he briefly forgot his sorrow. What is this place? Dantes didn't turn around. He couldn't without putting Tell down. This is my garden. This is where the fruit comes from. They took a few steps further inside. How'd you find this place? Asked Wayne. Dantes hesitated to answer for a moment. Had played things very close to the chest so far, only letting those he knew were doomed anyway know what he was able to do. He felt a momentary temptation to tell Wayne the truth. I found an old book, deep in the outskirts near Kobold territory. Most of it was faded, but I found a map and some instructions. It led me here. Wayne frowned, which Dantes could only see because he was watching him through Jacopo's eyes, and they reached the center of the garden, where the elven corpses had long since been consumed and overgrown. They placed Telephone's body gently on a patch of bare ground, just a bit larger than his body. Dantes gestured to the garden. It feeds on blood. I usually give it some of my own, but it wants more than I can provide now. Is that why we brought Tell here? Dantes nodded. It's one of the reasons. I also just thought he really would rather be here than picked at in a dark corner somewhere. Wayne looked around at the trees around him and knelt to the ground, where he ran his hand up the body of a red vine. I think you're right. Wayne flexed his hand. I do expect this place to be magical, but my hands and feet don't feel chilled. Had it novel been at? Dantes shrugged. He himself had no idea how his druid abilities were different from mage's powers, just that they were, but he didn't mind it. Maybe it's a holy place? God-granted power is different. What did the journal say? just the map and images that told me what to do. Do you still have it? Maybe I could learn more. Dantes cursed himself, mentioning a book of forbidden knowledge to a mage. Of course, He'd want to see it, no matter the circumstance he found himself in. It was falling apart when I found it. It crumbled to nothing a few days after I found it. I think some rats used the bits of it that were left as nesting. Wayne's frown remained. He clearly had more questions, but he could also tell that Dantes had no intention of giving him all the information he wanted, and standing over Telephone's corpse, he couldn't bring himself to press it. Why did you bring me here? You could have carried the body yourself if you wanted to. Dantes made a sweeping gesture. I'm giving this to you. Wayne blinked. What? The garden. I was initially planning on giving it to you, and till I suppose in a way I still am. Wayne folded his arms. How are you doing it? Dantes raised his eyebrow. Doing what? We can skip the back and forth. I've been gambling with you for nearly 4 years. We've smoked together, drank together, worked together. You wouldn't give up an asset like this for nothing unless it no longer had value to you. That means you're either planning on dying or getting out. Considering how well you've attempted to die in the past, my guess is on the latter. Dantes nodded. I am planning to escape, and he'll tell you where and when I'm planning on it. If you want to try to follow me, that's on you. Wayne nodded. Before that, I'm going after the orcs. We all are. Merle was already discussing retaliation and bringing in what was left of the dwarves. No, alone. Wayne chuckled incredulously. What? Dantes kept his gaze steady. You're serious. I'm going to go as soon as we're done burying Tell. I wanted to give you one chance to let me know if there are any of them you wanted me to spare. Wayne turned a lighter shade of green as the blood drained from his face. You're going to try to kill all of them? At least Blood and any others I can find in their territory. Wayne stood there silent, unsure of what to say. He'll ask again. Are there any you would want to spare? Dantes and Jacopo crawled through the tunnels, leading a horde of rats and roaches. Dantes had almost no difficulty adjusting to being a rat, but in spite of that he had a bit of trouble keeping up as Jacopo led them through the quickest and most efficient route to orc territory. It was what amounted to nighttime in the pit, and the majority of the orcs were asleep, though around 10 had gone on a hunt for beasts with blood. He had tracked them until they were too far away to make a difference in what was about to happen. They exited not at the entrance to the Orcish territory, but rather slightly behind it. 4 orcs stood at the entrance, alert and ready for any counterattack that the collared or dwarves might be planning to mount. Dantes ignored them, spreading out his 4 or 6-legged allies across the space. It was difficult controlling this many, and his favor was burning up quickly, but he had plenty for what he was planning. He moved through the territory toward the first of his targets. His visits to the orc gang had been infrequent, but had been scouting them since their increase in aggression, and so it was familiar to him. In one corner, a giant spider and kobold had been butchered for their meat and distributed to the gang, bloodstains and the smell of rot telling the story clearly. Toward the center of it was a pit of coarse sand dyed red and mixed with shards of tooth and bone. Their fighting pit, where those of them waiting for the recruiters to pay a visit trained for their chance to take up the mantle of the Green Blight and possibly fight well enough to escape. There were decorations and trophies scattered all throughout the space, as well as discarded weapons and tools littering different corners. On the surface, back in Rendhold, Dantes had known orcs that were bookish scholars, elves that were thuggish brutes, and gnomes with no head for numbers. But in the pit they all seemed to devolve into whatever the most common idea of themselves was. Then again, they were all criminals that may have had more to do with it. Dantes reached a trio of sleeping orcs in an offshoot cave. He shifted back into his usual shape, the pain from it making him soundlessly wince. He looked at their sleeping faces, checking for a scared ear, a flower tattoo, or a neck with a healing spider bite. He found none. These weren't the orcs Wayne had asked him to spare. He drew his dagger, having traded his rapier with Jason for a more practical weapon shortly after his meeting with Wayne. He moved silently, finding doing so to be easier than it ever had been before, and knelt just behind the largest of the three's head. He covered the orc's mouth and slit his throat in a single smooth motion. When it was done, he frowned for a moment, watching the blood drain from him as the light left his eyes. Dantes had killed before. Head killed in Rendhold, even before Head ended up in the pit. It wasn't usually his first choice of solution, but Head never hesitated to resort to it when it was necessary or even just easier. Still, Head never done it so calmly as he just had. The way Head drawn the dagger across the man's throat had felt almost matter-of-fact. He looked at Jacopo, who was keeping an eye on the other two orcs. Jacopo had developed a taste for revenge through Dantes, but Dantes had discounted how Jacopo may be influencing him. Their connection wasn't a one-way street, he knew that, but he hadn't considered how they'd affect one another in the long term. This kind of practical and relaxed killing was new to him, but from the feelings and impressions he received from Jacopo, that was how he performed most of his violence. He let out a breath. He didn't have time to think through it, and even if he did, it wouldn't change what he was there to do. He moved to the next of them, and then the third. Once they were all dead, he took the Mother's Reach seed from his coat pocket, feeling it radiate power from the daily dose of his blood had been giving it, and held it up to each of the orcs' necks, letting their blood flow over and be absorbed by it. Hold! The story has been illicitly taken. Should you find it on Amazon, report the infringement. He sent that command to it, and could feel burning frustration shoot back at him. The seed wanted nothing more than to grow, to sink its roots and spread its branches. But Dantes wouldn't let it, and it raged harder and harder as blood continued to fill it with potential and vitality. With the orc's blood added to it, it actually began to radiate real heat along with the pulsing and vibrating it had already been doing. It was like the beating heart of a roaring sun. At it novel been at. Dantes shifted back into rat form, checking each of the other locations he was tracking and moving to the next one. He could move almost silently as a man, but as a rat, even if he wasn't silent, no one would find it suspicious that he was walking around. He visited 4 more groups of sleeping orcs, some in pairs, some thirds, and in one case 5. Each time he repeated the same process, slashing throats one by one, gathering their blood into the seed, and then returning to rat form to go to the next group, all while using his allies to monitor where they all were and what they were doing. He reached the main sleeping quarters last. There he located the 3 that Wayne had asked him to spare, and he marked them in his mind. He returned to his normal self and crept to the closest of them. He raised his dagger in preparation, when an orc in the center of the group suddenly sat up, turning to his side and vomiting foul bile that reeked of alcohol onto another of the orcs. Suddenly, the orcs were all waking up, and while he himself was distracted, the orc he was holding the dagger over awoke and screamed. Dantes cursed and quickly plunged the dagger into his throat, killing him. The other orcs all began to stand and move toward him, many of them instinctually grabbing weapons they slept with. He could see through the other rats that the 4 guards were heading his way too. He considered turning back into a rat and scurrying away, but then the memories of burying Telephone's corpse, removing his head and collar, the feeling of his finger in his coat pocket, all of it hit his mind like an explosion. He held the dagger up defensively as the orcs approached, raised his left hand, and snapped his finger. The sound echoed across the cavern, even above the war cries, for just a moment, and then the thousands of roaches that were hanging from the roof of the cavern all dropped down at the same time. The orcs' war cries turned to screams as the roaches swarmed across their bodies, into their clothes, and even their open mouths. Dantes surged forward in the confusion, his knife finding orc after orc in the struggle, dropping them one by one, while others were suffocated by the concentrated effort of thousands of roaches. The 4 guard arrived and found themselves confused and horrified by the scene before them. Their discipline kicked in quickly, though, and they located and charged toward Dantes. That's when Dantes ordered the rats to join the fray. Before the guards had reached him, they were swarmed by rats and roaches as their companions had been, and just as they had, they dropped their weapons, falling to the ground and tearing handfuls of roaches and whole rats from themselves, but they couldn't do so faster than the vermin could be replaced. Dantes moved quickly, watching as the gold in his roach and rat marks rapidly dwindled. He moved from orc to orc, avoiding their flailing and doing his best to mortally wound them before moving on to the next one. It wasn't a grand battle or an even brawl. It was an ugly execution. When it was done, all but 2 of the orcs were dead. They'd either suffocated under the press of fur and chitin, or Dantes had finished them himself with his dagger, which, even though it was of fine elven make, had grown dull and chipped to near unusability. He leaned against a wall and panted heavily. With what little favor he had left, he checked on Blood's location. He was on his way back, but Dantes still had time. He moved from orc to orc, checking them for small valuables and coin, and let the rats and roaches had been controlling do as they wanted with the bodies, hoping to restore at least some of the favor Head lost. He directed them away from the 2 Head spared for Wayne. Head accidentally killed Dune, the one with the scarred ear, in the fray. He felt a tinge of guilt at that, but there was nothing he could do about it now. Once he was done looting the bodies, netting almost 30 copper, a couple silver, and a silver ring, he fed the Mother's Reach seed on last time. After that, he took the orc closest to the exit and spilled some of his blood onto his hands. He then walked to the entrance and wrote a short message for Blood, after which he took out a tea light and lit it underneath the message to shine clear light on it. "Meet me in the maw, Dantes." He nodded at his handiwork, and he and Jacopo walked into the tunnels, covered in bloodstains with the seed pulsing with power and heat by their hearts. Jacopo crawled in Dantes' jacket and settled into a pocket towards his back. "This is a much better method of travel," he said, burrowing as far into the pocket as he could. "Really? You seem to move much more quickly when we were running through the tunnels together." Jacopo began chewing on a small piece of lint, settling into a position reminiscent of sailors laying in hammocks. "No, this is definitely better." Dantes chuckled, still covered in blood and worn out from the fight, but then humor had always been one of the ways Head alleviate stress. He moved into a small offshoot cave and uncovered his pack. Inside was all of the gold and valuables Head been collecting over the last few months. All of the easily preservable food he felt was worth bringing, a handful of fruit seeds Head felt compelled to pack for some reason, and a rope Head made himself out of the rags that had served as his bed. He added the coins and valuables Head taken from the orcs, adding all of it up in his head. He had about 50 gold in mixed coins, and maybe another 20 in random valuables, though he felt confident he could barter for more. It was a small fortune, both in the underprison and in the slums on the surface, though here in the prison it couldn't buy him nearly as much as it could out of it. It was a good start, a helpful amount of resources to get things started if he made it out. Head hoped to have more, but Head accelerated his own timeline when Head chosen the path he was taking with Blood. "We will see the city soon?" asked Jacopo. Dantes rested his right hand over the Mother's Reach seed, feeling its power. "Yes, very soon. I just need to make a few stops first, and then we make a flashy exit." "Is that wise?" "No, but making a statement can have value." "As you did when you felled the elves?" "Yes, or like you did when you killed and ate your cousin." Jacopo nodded, an expression Dantes could feel but not see. "Yes, this makes sense." Dantes walked a few more feet. "The finger you took from the golden-haired one, the elf, is that also for a statement? As the years were? At it novel been at." Dantes sighed. "No, just hoping I can use it to fulfill his last wish is all." "Does his last wish matter?" "He is dead. To me it does." Complications?" Dantes nodded. "Yes, complications." They walked the rest of the way in silence until Dantes reached the undermarket. The sellers trying to peddle goods outside of the market started towards him, then stopped in their tracks as they noticed he was covered in blood. Those who were just on their way and also stopped in their tracks as they followed the eyes of the sellers. When he reached the guards, both the kobold and the dwarf actually broke their stoic gaze into the middle distance, which the consortium guards were famous for, to glare at him and then look wide-eyed at one another to decide whether or not they should stop him. He made that decision for them, walking past them without even acknowledging their stares. The rest of the market reacted similarly to him, and he was gratified to have the way to the witch cleared for him, reducing the amount of time it took him to reach it significantly. He was also grateful to see that it was Sin manning the front, in the guise of a female magister with a stern expression and black magisterial robe that was somehow tight enough that you could see the divots in her hips. She looked Dantes up and down, her smile never fading, even on the flicker of her true form he glimpsed for a moment. "None of that's your blood, is it?" He shook his head. Nope. If you encounter this story on Amazon, note that it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. What's going on? Dantes looked at the small crowd of people gawking at them. Inside? She nodded, and they moved to her room, the nameless moving to block the entry as they did so. "I'll ask again," said Sin. "What's going on? Have any of the collared been here today? Maybe Wayne?" She frowned. "No, I don't even think Orbus has been by, and lately he's been here every Tindui since that deal for drink you had put in place." Dante's frown deepened. That meant she didn't know what had happened. The collard had locked down, and the orcs hadn't had much time to spread the news either. The orcs attacked the collard while they were moving the last shipment of booze from Meztel, escaped the attack to warn everyone, but he didn't survive. Sin's form flickered for a moment, and on the pale, white changeling face, he could see an expression of pure anger and malice that quickly vanished back behind the stern expression she'd been wearing as a faux magister. After that, she glanced back down at the blood on Dante's coat. "You and the collard already paid them a visit? We would have supplied some nameless to aid you, had you asked." "No, not the collard. Just me. Took a few guards out, or found the ones that killed Tell." Dantes shook his head. "No, I killed all but 2 that Wayne asked me to spare, though Blood was away with a raiding group at the time." "You're saving him for last?" "Yes." Sin stood there silently for a few moments. She had always been able to absorb anything Dantes said or did with ease, even often seeming to have predicted his actions before they happened. But it seemed he had reached her limit. "Tell wanted me to say, or someone to tell you, that you were the best lay he ever had." She chuckled and shook her head, a bitter expression taking over her stolen features. "He was young. He should have been able to say that about someone that loved him." Dantes let that statement hang in the air, unsure of how to respond to it. He decided to push past it, the eyes he had in the tunnel telling him that Blood was arriving at his message at just that moment. "Am leaving or dying today." Sin nodded slowly, taking the moment to remove the genuine emotion that had invaded her features. "It's about time." Dantes raised an eyebrow. "For me to die or leave?" Sin shrugged, the magisterial robes tightening provocatively at the gesture. "Either, I suppose." Dantes frowned. "If you come with me to the Maw, you might be able to escape. It's a narrow window, but if you act on the opportunity when it arises." Sin shook her head. "You know that I'm bound here by Fae law more than anything. And if I escape, is there some way to free you?" She shifted her eye color to red, then blue, then purple as she thought. "The magister who bound me would have to release me from the binding. After that, I could escape myself." "What's her name? What'd she look like?" Sin laughed, her form shifting, but only to add elf ears and make her features slightly less symmetrical. "I was actually already in her shape. Give or take a few subtle changes, it gives me a bit of satisfaction to take her form with clients every so often." Dantes chuckled, feeling a bit of the tension he was carrying loosen. Then he took a hard look at her, committing the face to his memory. "And her name?" "I don't know. We aren't able to know. Their Nemesis is a precaution." Dantes nodded. It would take some effort, but assuming he got out of face, and knowing that she was a magister should be enough for him to find her. "I'll do my best to take care of it. Assuming I survive, where will this escape of yours take place?" "The Maw, where I can be certain Blood will find me there. Then I will be there too. It'll be dangerous, even if you aren't planning to escape." She smiled. "Every fight needs a beautiful woman in the audience." Dantes smiled and nodded at her, making his way out of the brothel and back out to the Undermarket. Blood was currently roaring and smashing things, but that wouldn't buy much time. Dantes had one more stop before he would be ready to meet him. He left the Undermarket and moved through the tunnels the smaller, unaffiliated gangs called home, reached the Shadow Cat's small cul-de-sac, where the 3 of them were shooting the shit while Jason cooked. It seemed that was the primary way they passed the time when they weren't working. When they saw him, their smiles faded, then they faded more when they saw the blood on his clothes. "Dantes, are you all right?" asked Jason, a bit of genuine concern bleeding through. The looks exchanged by Jake and Zach echoed the sentiment. Dantes shook his head. "Honestly, no, it's been a pretty shit day." He checked the rats outside of the orc gang entrance and saw that Blood was on the move. He didn't have much time. "Listen, I'm about to fight Blood in the Maw. If you come with me and are quick and smart, there's a chance you'll be able to escape. There's also a chance you'll die. It's up to you." Jake frowned. "You don't expect us to fight blood, do you?" "No." "Then why are you telling us? Need us to help keep his men off of you? Or rob some people in the crowd? Maybe rough someone up while everyone's distracted? Or beat up that gnome again?" offered Zach. "No, this isn't a job, just a warning. You've done me a few good turns, and I just thought I'd do you the same favor. Show up or don't, it's up to you." With that, Dantes turned and walked away toward the maw. Dantes stood in the center of the maw, feeling the sun warm his skin. It was a feeling he missed, though that hadn't made him seek out the maw in the past. Putting yourself in the center of a beam of light was something one should typically avoid in prison. Still, he hadn't exactly been smart about that since everything had started with the Elfland Kings. Had put himself into the center of things more and more, and had enjoyed every second of it. It felt like tasting who he was before Head been thrown down into the Underprison. Before Head lost everything. There was a way he could have done things that could have avoided a lot of the trouble, but at the same time some of it was almost certainly inevitable. Whether he rose in the shadows or the light, Head make enemies. That was simply the cost of rising. May as well choose the method he enjoyed more. No, that wasn't quite right. If Head taken more care, Tell may be alive. There had to be a balance, and he needed to work to find it after his final display in the Underprison. He looked at the edge of the light coming down from the maw. There were a number of people gathering, curious about what the foolish mutt was doing before they recognized him. Then their curiosity only grew. None of them approached him once they recognized him. One of the benefits of being known and feared. He reached out to the rats. He had tracking blood. He was tearing his way through the undermarket. Had nearly arrived. Dantes reached his hand into his jacket and cupped the mother's reach seed in his hand. It was hard to hold, the heat and pulsating making his entire body shake as he held it. When he reached out to it, he was stunned by a kind of roar that reminded him of the last typhoon Head seen hit the docks. He felt the same desire Head felt from all seeds, to unleash their potential and grow. But this volume was beyond even the craving for blood Head fell from his garden before Head managed to quell it. Not much longer. He sent the thought to it, but wasn't even sure that the seed could understand over its own roar. He placed it back into his jacket. Will it be much longer? No, it shouldn't be. Could you not simply use the seed now and escape? Blood's forces are scattered. Even the collared or changelings alone could take them now. You've been watching my thoughts? Yes. It is a way to pass the time. You often think of the places called brothels. Well, I grew up in one, hang out and gamble in one down here. I haven't seen a woman in 5 years, so that checks out. You have the thoughts about leaving now yourself, so let us leave. Isn't it going to be more dangerous with more people? Not to mention the chance the blood manages to kill you. More people may provide me more cover too. There's more than a mile of old ruined buildings and a tall wall between the maw and the rest of the city. Used to have a lot of people living there, but it turns out it ain't popular to live close to a pit full of criminals. The more people climbing up behind me, the more cover I get. Jacopo thought about it. That's not why, though, is it? No. Dantes thought again of Telephone's face wrapped in cloth and laying in the garden. Revenge? Yes. He could sense Jacopo nodding. Worth the risk, then. The narrative has been taken without permission. Report any sightings. Exactly. And this is just the start. Once we're in the city, there will be even more waiting for us. Jacopo nodded, content with Dante's answers, and crawled back down into a pocket toward the back of his jacket. The crowd that was gathering had grown even larger as word that blood was on his way had spread, and a few dozen people were scrambling to get spots with a good view, and there were even shouts of bets being taken. Dantes couldn't see the shadow cats in the crowd, or Wayne, but he felt a pair of eyes on and turned to Season boldly wearing the shape of a tall, regal woman in a high hairstyle and flowing gown, flanked by 10 nameless bodyguards. She gave Dantes a wink, which he returned, just as a commotion began. Blood was massive to a degree that was baffling to see in person. He stood easily 7.5 feet tall, making him nearly 2 feet taller than Dantes, and he was about half as wide as he was tall. He was perhaps the only one in the Underprison who could make Merle jealous of his musculature. There had been rumors that his mother had lain with a giant to make him, and he was known even on the surface for his skill in a fight when he acted as a mercenary for the Fingers who would hire him when they needed exceptional violence done in a bombastic manner. Between his conversations with Wayne, Riker, the Shadow Cats, and a few others, Head pieced together that Blood was actually not the most popular orc and acted more as a figurehead than an actual leader, but that unlike many in his position, he was aware of his role, which made him smarter and more dangerous than many might give him credit for. Dantes turned his attention to him. He really only had one shot at what he was planning, and so he drew the seed from his jacket and held it in his hand, fighting the shaking it was causing in him. Blood pushed through the crowd and raised an absolutely massive and chipped axe to point at Dantes. He roared. Dantes looked left and right dramatically before pointing at himself. Who, me? How did you kill my men? Who helped you? He was closing in, looking around the ground for any traps that might be hidden in the sand. The dialogue was to gain information, but it was also clear that he wasn't underestimating his opponent. No one helped me. Well, except for your girlfriend, once before I got thrown down here. I don't think that's what you were asking about, though. At novel been at it. Blood didn't take the bait, instead continuing in a slow circle around Dantes, sizing him up and assessing other threats. He knew from what Riker had told him that Dantes was clever and deceitful, which made him cautious. Dantes watched him circle, his hand gripping the seed tightly. He started to hear some yelling from the surface of the maw. The guards seemed to have taken notice of what was going on. 10 copper on the big one, yelled one of the guards mockingly. No one would take that bet. The other one's a bug compared to him. Dantes ignored them. There wasn't anything wrong with being a bug as far as he was concerned, and it was all the more impressive when a bug felled a lion. Blood's instincts were screaming at him that there was some kind of trap, but his senses couldn't detect anything. Nothing hidden in the sand. His remaining boys were in the crowd, looking for any backup he might have, but all of the mutt's known allies that were there seemed to be keeping their distance. He could back away, but that would make him look weak, besides which the mutt needed to die twice over for what had done to Riker, and now to the rest of his gang. Head hoped to take him down slowly, but now it was kill or be killed by the other gangs, just as the dwarves were. He needed to make a bloody statement then and there, no matter what his instincts told him. Blood was stronger than Dantes and faster. He could reach him in less than 3 full steps and bring down his axe. Even if Dantes dodged the initial strike, once he was in Blood's range, it wouldn't matter. There'd be no escaping him. Unfortunately, while all Blood needed to do was charge a short distance and bring his axe down, something he could do in moments, all that Dantes had to do was lift the seed in his hand and think a command. Grow! A root shot from a seed with the force of a blunderbuss, firing and pierced through Blood's heart, passing entirely through his body and driving into the sand that covered them all. He died with a look of confusion on his face, cursing himself for not trusting his instincts. The seed didn't stop there and shot out a dozen more roots that pierced the ground. They grew and pulsed in a way that reminded Dantes of the god of rats' tails that had all been tied together. Once the roots were embedded, they began to spread and thicken, and soon from the center, a trunk began to coalesce. Dantes took position, and the moment its first branch began to form, he grabbed it, and then the tree started to rise. As Dantes rose up, clinging desperately to the first branch the mother's reach had sprouted, he realized very quickly that it was starting to widen. He threw himself up so that he could switch to standing on it, but was soon forced to dodge as 2 more branches began to sprout nearby and nearly hit him. He crouched down and found himself being thrust further and further from the trunk as the branch widened and expanded. He was forced into a completely reactionary posture, dodging new branches, jumping to different branches, and climbing up and down as needed, all to stay near the top of the tree as it rapidly grew toward the exit to the pit. He was vaguely aware of motion both above and below him as he struggled to stay well positioned on the tree. The guard were doing their best to react to the sudden and unforeseen sprouting of a tree in the center of the maw, and dozens of prisoners were all doing their best to follow Dantes' lead and find hand and footfalls that would allow them to ride and climb to the top in order to escape. They were having much less luck than Dantes, who was an accomplished climber long before Head fallen into the pit and had been practicing it rigorously for months. They fell or were punctured by swiftly growing branches, or grabbed a branch and held on for dear life, but clearly had no idea what to do or where to go from there. Dantes spared a thought for the shadow cats, who he could no longer see and didn't dare splitting his focus among nearby rats and roaches to try and find them. He also wondered after Wayne, but he was a cautious sort, and while he may decide to attempt an escape, Dantes doubted he'd be one of the first to make the climb. Had it novel been at. The branch Dantes was on seemed to be stabilizing as the top of the tree neared the lip of the maw. Dantes began running toward the edge of the branch, hoping to time his jump exactly at the moment it crested the opening. He was off slightly, and when he leapt he was a full 10 feet above the edge of the maw. He looked down to see a grizzled guard staring wide-eyed, holding a spear that he hadn't thought to raise. Dantes aimed his knees and could feel the man's collarbone shatter as he hit him and knocked him to the ground before rolling off of him. "Watch out below, fucker." Dantes couldn't resist the comment, remembering how many prisoners' heads seen flattened by the sacks and crates that the guards purposefully aimed at prisoners as they threw them. There were 2 more guards in the way, and rather than engage them, he moved to run between them. They were so overwhelmed by the tree that had begun to grow, and Dante's appearance that they weren't able to react before he had passed them by completely, dashing into the cover of ruined buildings that spread out from the maw since the underprison had been formed. There were no major defenses at the maw itself. After all, the several hundred feet sheer and smooth walls all the way down were all that was needed to ensure that prisoners couldn't escape, particularly after the Academy had expended some of its enormous resources to seal all potential exits and entrances with magic aside from the maw itself. The guard presence there was primarily to send supplies into the maw and maintain the large jail that acted as a holding facility for prisoners until the monthly drops. Outside of the maw was more than a mile of ruins that had once been occupied before the entrance to the underprison had first been found when the maw had opened as a sinkhole, killing hundreds. After that, and it being turned into a prison, no resident would stand to live there, so the city had a 10-foot wall built around it and ignored it. Dantes didn't stop running once he hit the ruins, instead pushing himself down alleys, up and over buildings, and through broken cobblestone streets. He estimated he was about halfway to the outer wall when he paused for a break. Running a straight mile would have been simple, but with the way the ruins were he was having to jump, climb, and crawl all throughout, and it was slowly exhausting him. Considering Head started the day with his usual workout, then slaughtered dozens of orcs, then fought their leader, then climbed a mother's reach as it grew, then began moving through the ruins, the exhaustion made sense. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. He pulled his water skin from the small bag Head packed and drank deeply from it, looking up. It was late afternoon, and the sun was high in the sky. The sky? Something He'd see once a month, he smiled. Jacopo crawled out from his jacket, sniffing. The air smells different up here. Dantes took a big breath. The air tasted fresh, at least compared to the underprison. He cupped a hand and poured some water into it, letting Jacopo crawl down his arm to have a drink. He looked back in the direction He'd been running from and swallowed. The tree was still growing. He could see it easily, even above the ruined buildings behind him, rising higher and higher. He may have underestimated the mother's reach's size. He maybe should have asked Clay for the second or third largest tree. Had only ever seen trees in the small gardens and parks scattered throughout the city, or occasionally in the dilapidated, overgrown quarters that had been left behind for some reason or another. At the rate it was growing, the tree may even rival the spires of the Academy. Jacopo tensed up, and Dantes felt anxiety radiating from him. "What is it?" he asked. "Predators." Dantes started to reach out his senses, but before he detected anything that way, he heard a familiar barking. Shit, the guard must manage to muster their people from the outside. "Those are scent hounds." Dantes pushed off from the wall He'd been leaning against. His legs and arms were on fire, but he couldn't afford to be caught at this point. Jacopo crawled back into his jacket as he moved, finding a secure inner pocket of his jacket to burrow into. Dantes hustled over a collapsed roof, through what seemed to have been a noble's house at some point, and dove through the remains of a window. The barking of the dogs would get louder, then quieter, then loud again as they lost and found his scent, and eventually they were close enough that he could even hear the guards. When the wall came into view, he realized that the dogs and their masters had somehow gotten both in front of and behind him. He clenched his jaw, taking cover between two walls that were barely standing. Had come so damn far and was too close to be caught again. He checked his rat and roach marks. They had a bit of juice left since his attack on the orcs, but not enough that he could just throw waves of vermin at his pursuers. He felt a pure crimson rage well up within him as he heard a dog approach not more than a block from where he sat crouched. Instinctually, as it had been with the awakening of all of his abilities, he reached out to all of the dogs, pouring the rage he felt into them. The rage at the thought of being captured at Telephone's death at his old gang, and a bit left over from his dad. The dogs' barking didn't stop, but instead became louder, angrier, and punctuated by fierce growling. Dantes could hear one of the guards curse. "Hell's is wrong with you lot? There was a whip crack. Get a hold of your ack. Fuck." Through his connection to the dogs, he could feel that they'd turned on their masters, and on one another. The rage Head channeled into them turned them to a berserker rage. He focused on slipping between them while they were tearing into each other. He knew that while Head brought on the state they were in, he had no control over them. He'd be as much of a target as anything else if they saw him. He left them behind and reached the wall. It was roughly 10 feet high, but not built perfectly smooth. He braced himself for one last climb, his hands and feet finding holds easily as he pulled himself further up and over the wall. At the top of it, he could see a dirty alleyway filled with garbage and detritus, with rats scurrying to and fro. Abandoned buildings stretched for several more blocks, but he could hear the echoes of angry men and women cursing at one another for the slightest offenses. The air smelled just a bit rancid, and in the distance he saw skinny pigeons and crows defecating from the roofs of buildings. He swung his leg over the wall and landed with his feet on old concrete. He was home. The first mile or so that Dantes walked was nothing, but empty alleyways filled with trash and rats. Even with the mile of space between the maw and the wall that sealed the space off, people still prefer to live as far from it as possible. Dantes couldn't blame them. He hadn't particularly wanted to live as close to it as he had either. He saw only vermin as he walked those first steps in the city, and he exchanged cursory hellos with them as he went, much to their surprise. Eventually, he began to run into the occasional homeless man sleeping off a hangover, or the sounds of someone living in an abandoned building, and in one case the corpse of a man who had taken too much dust and died with a wide grin on his face. After that, he started to hear the city proper and could see through small cracks in alleyways signs of life. Dantes walked calmly toward the sounds of people, rickshaws, carriages, and commerce. He relished the noise of his boots on concrete echoing down the alleys as he moved. Before he entered the main road, he looked at his outfit. While it had been coated in blood, now there was a nice thick layer of dirt and grime, making it impossible to tell what was staining him, which saved him the trouble of needing to stick to the alleys. The sun was beginning to fade, and he cast a long shadow as he stepped out onto a main road, pulling up his hood and falling in line with the rest of the crowd as he gradually made his way down the street. He took stock of where he was as he calmly walked among the crowd. None of them had any clue he was a convict, and while people seemed animated, it seemed mostly to be due to the end of the day, causing a rush of people out of businesses and a few last-ditch efforts at commerce from those businesses before everyone made their way home. Everyone was dressed and clean, but well-worn to nice clothing with a few standouts here and there. The businesses were mostly cobblers, tailors, and the street was long and narrow. He realized he was on the worst end of Needle Street, where the average citizen of Rendhold could get their clothing repaired or, in very rare instances, made for a special occasion. The buildings there were low and clustered tightly together with only a few small slum towers scattered here and there behind them. He could reach Midtown relatively quickly from Needle Street, but after hearing that it was under the control of Mondego, he wasn't sure that would be wise. There was a chance no one would recognize him. It had been 5 years, and he knew well that he no longer looked as he once did. Still, he wasn't about to start taking such heavy risks so soon after his escape. I'm telling you, I can see it from my apartment. A huge fucking tree just appeared out of nowhere. Sure, Dan. How about you guy back to that apartment and sleep it off? Okay, buddy. The man, Dan presumed Dantes, fumed. I'm telling you, I know what I saw. Why do you think we saw all those guardsmen rushing that way earlier? Because some asshole accidentally scuffed a noble's boots. Or a shop didn't pay protection money. Who gives a shit? Dantes kept walking. It would take some time for news of what had happened to travel, but the tree would be a hard thing to hide. Still, it wouldn't be smart for him to stay out on the streets as he was. Outside of Midtown, he had few contacts, and of those he had, even fewer that he trusted. He could simply find a room somewhere, pay for it, and settle in for the night, and get his information slowly over time using Jacopo and whatever other vermin he could muster. That wouldn't do, though, not for his first night free. He wanted information, contacts, and one other thing that the one person Head considered trusting could provide. He made his way further down the length of Needle Street until he reached the worst part of it, where a few stalls sold clothes still soiled with grave dirt, and beggars began to outnumber working folk. He stopped at one of the obvious gravedigger stalls and haggled for a fresh pair of pants and shirt for a copper piece. It wasn't the first time Head worn a dead man's clothes, though if he was lucky it might be the last. He shoved the clothes in his pack for later, and from there he twisted down a few alleyways and began following the smell of salt and moisture. After 20 or so minutes of walking, he reached the edges of the docks. The sun had fully set at this point, and Dantes could see the groups of academy students escorted by guards as they went from lamppost to lamppost, lighting each of them with a bit of spell fire. Dantes passed them by, keeping his hood drawn and moving down a few more side streets. It was strange seeing magic being done so casually. Had grown and used to that in the Underprison. He was too tired to put much thought into it. The elation of his escape had given him the second wind Head needed to make it to this point, but he was flagging, and his feet screamed at him within his boots. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. He exited one more alley and looked to his right. There, as if nothing had happened in the last 5 years, sat the vivacious vixen. The building was old, perhaps as old as the docks, and, as far as Dantes knew, it had always been a brothel, though it had many names before settling on its current one. The wooden sign was only a little worse for wear, with the sultry, buxom, fox-headed woman now missing the tip of one of her ears. Dantes walked up to the front door and pushed it open. His nose was struck by the smell of perfume and wine, and before his eyes could fully adjust to the well-lit interior, a feminine voice, haughty and with a touch of cruelty, spoke to him. "You'll have to leave. I doubt you can afford the services here." Dantes pushed his hood back, running a hand through his hair to push it back out of his face. The girl who had addressed him was leaning against the doorway, wearing a dark pink corset and short frilly black skirt that concealed burgundy leggings beneath. She was human, young, maybe 17 or 19, with black hair falling in waves over her shoulders, brown eyes, and a furrowed brow. He realized he was staring. It had been some time since Head spoken to a woman whose form didn't flicker into a pale-skinned, black-eyed fae. And even though the girl wasn't his type, 5 years was a long time. "Hey, Decker, may need some help with this one." A large orc stepped into the center of the doorway behind her. Dantes held up his hands. "Sorry, don't want any trouble. I'm looking for an old friend. Her name is Vera. She used to work here." The girl raised an eyebrow. "The madam? I can't see how she would know someone like you. She'd gotten a promotion since Dantes had last seen her. Good for her. How about you tell her I'm here, and maybe you can ask her." The bouncer and her exchanged a glance that indicated to Dantes they were leaning strongly toward just throwing him out. He could probably take Decker, his dagger was dull, but they clearly thought he was just some urchin, which meant that Head underestimated him. Dantes didn't want to fight, though. Decker and the girl were really just doing their jobs, and quite well. "Listen, you have a bar, right? He'll buy a drink, and one for Decker here if he wants it, and he can keep an eye on me while you tell her that Edmund is here. How about that?" Decker looked at the girl with a kind of ocular shrug. He clearly wouldn't mind a drink. The girl sighed. "Fine. Wait at the bar. Vera's working the books, so I doubt she'll want to talk to you even if she does know you." Decker moved to the side, keeping an eye on Dantes as he moved to the bar. The interior of the place hadn't changed aside from maybe some new upholstery on the couches and the brothel's inhabitants. The bar was a long piece of dark wood. There were curtains in shades of purple, pink, and light blue hung all over the walls, hiding the aging wood walls behind them, and girls laid on heavily padded couches in various states of undress. He recognized none of them, but that was the nature of their business. 5 years was more than enough time for a lot of turnaround. He was just glad that Vera was still there. Dantes sat at the bar and gestured toward a wine at the middle shelf. The half-elf woman bartending was wearing a thick cotton shirt and dark brown trousers in sharp contrast to the other women in the bar. She nodded and quietly poured him a glass. She had enough professionalism to make no comments on Dantes' appearance. In appreciation of that, Dantes himself did his best to not stare at how well she filled out her shirt and trousers, which for a man who went from seeing only men to being in a brothel, took more self-control than head cared to admit. He pulled a few copper from a pocket and slid it over to the woman, who nodded. "So, Decker, what'll it be for you?" He raised a hand to his chin, scratching it thoughtfully. He was a big orc, not blood big, but certainly the proper size to be a bouncer at a whorehouse. His tusks were capped with decorative silver, and his hair was braided with jewelry that reminded Dantes a bit of Stone Clan's beards. I'll have a dry white today. A fresh bottle, poured in a wide glass so that it can breathe. He pointed a thumb at Dantes. "This one is paying." The elf sighed, reached up a bit above the middle shelf, pulled a corkscrew out and popped it. Then she pulled out a wide-brimmed glass and poured it in, giving it a delicate twirl as she did so. "Here you are, Your Highness." She delivered the line without a hint of humor, which made it that much more amusing. Decker smiled. "Thank you much." Dantes was sliding 6 copper her way before she even told him the prices. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't question the convenience of it, and slid the coins toward her side of the bar. Dantes sipped his wine in silence. The flavor was good, and the wine was strong, but strangely enough, he remembered it tasting better than it was. Either the quality of wine had changed since he was in prison, or Mez really was a master brewer. Dantes heard footsteps coming from the stairs, and saw first the young woman who had greeted him, and behind her someone else. She was an elegant 5'10", wearing a plain emerald green gown, a silver necklace, and bangles shaped like foxes on each wrist. Her hair was auburn, with a few new streaks of white, and her face was still beautiful, even with a few new wrinkles. Her eyes were wide with surprise, and her mouth widened into a smile as she saw him. Dante smiled back. "Hello, Annie. It's been a while." Dante smiled and stood, meeting Vera for a big, open-armed hug. She smelled of roses and vanilla. Her taste in perfume hadn't changed. The scent immediately brought a flood of memories to the surface of him playing as Vera and his mother chatted, cooked, and played cards. She released her embrace, still smiling as she looked him up and down, only a slight twitch of her eyebrow indicating some mild discomfort over his state of dress. "Edmund, I wasn't sure I'd see you again. Please, come with me to my office. We need to catch up. I'd like that." Decker, pick a bottle of wine to set aside, along with some cheese and some of those sweetmeats that Zilly thinks I don't know are hidden in a corner of the bar. The elf bartender, Zilly's ears twitched, but her expression remained passive. "Of course, Madame Vera." Vera nodded, and gestured for Dantes to follow her up the stairs, which he did. The upper level was mostly single rooms, many of which had the typical sounds and smells of a brothel emanating from them. At the far end of the hall was the only door with a lock. Vera opened it and gestured Dantes inside. Unlike the gaudy decoration throughout the rest of the brothel, Vera's room had a simple elegance to it. There was a black carpet with bluefish patterns woven throughout, a wood desk with multiple sheets of paper and an abacus, a circle of lightly padded sitting chairs around a small table and tea set. There was a bed, concealed behind a mesh screen that showed only shadows, and behind the desk, toward the center of the room, was the bust of a woman, over which there had been placed a gray veil. In front of that were a few gold coins, some dried flowers, and a saucer filled with clear water. "An altar to the goddess of hidden women?" asked Dantes. Vera looked at it, as if just remembering it was there. After your mother, it felt like something he needed to start doing. Dantes nodded. He wouldn't have felt right, honoring his mother in that particular way. It wasn't called the goddess of hidden people after all. He was glad to see Vera had done so, though. Vera looked at him, and as her eyes started to water, she brought a knuckle to her eyes to wipe away a tear before it could smudge her makeup. I never thought I'd see you again, Dantes. He thought tears might well up in his own eyes, but they didn't. I never thought I'd see you again either, Annie. She gestured for him to sit in one of the padded chairs, while she began heating the teapot with a burn stick. You're lucky I remember that bastard's name for you. Dantes nodded. I thought it might be smart not to use my real name. At least not until I knew where things stood. Vera nodded slowly. Prison made you more cautious, I see. Dantes shrugged. Not enough to keep me out of trouble, but I'm a bit better at picking the kind of trouble now. She chuckled and took a breath to regain her composure. How? How did you escape? It's a bit unbelievable. There was a fight in a maw. That's where the supplies and prisoners are dropped, and a tree started growing. It sprouted all the way up and out of the maw. I started climbing, then running before I knew it I was out. This was the only place I could think to go. Did other people climb the tree as well? Probably. I wasn't exactly looking back as I climbed. News of that probably wouldn't have hit the docks until morning. The edge of the city will probably take a full day after that. Are you going to make for the walls? Maybe sign up to crew on a ship? Unauthorized usage. This tale is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. Dantes shrugged. I'm a fugitive, but it's not as if they kept track of us down there. I'm not leaving. Vera bit her lip. There may be other reasons it's not safe for you. Mondego? Vera nodded. If he knows you're out, it will be dangerous for you. Dantes laughed. No, it's going to be dangerous for him, in fact. Vera opened her mouth, but was interrupted by the whistle of the teapot. She poured it into each small porcelain cup, the leaves of the tea rising to the surface as the water slowly turned brown. Is there anything I can say or do to convince you to just get on a boat? The Vixen has come a long way since you were last here. We serve mostly ship's officers now. I could get you work. You could have a good life outside of Rendhold. Add it novel been at. No, said Dantes with conviction that could shatter stone. Vera sighed. Okay, I just couldn't call myself your mother's friend if I hadn't tried. Unfortunately for her, you're her son, and vindictiveness is in your blood. Dantes lifted the tea and tasted it. It was the same horrifically bitter cheap blend Shed always drank, which he found oddly comforting, and so followed it up with a second sip. As the warmth of it spread through him, he felt a profound weariness. Every muscle was sore, his will was exhausted from controlling plants and vermin, and had been awake for nearly a full day, maybe more. Annie, I have questions, and I'm sure you have your own, but I don't know that I can keep myself awake much longer. He needed to stay sharp, and unfortunately, his powers hadn't yet given him some way around needing sleep. Moved. Vera nodded. Of course. They'll get you dinner in a room. I can pay. She shook her head. I'm sure you managed to pickpocket plenty to afford a night here, but don't worry about it. They'll have it covered. She stood and walked to the door, gesturing for Dantes to follow. When they arrived at the bottom of the steps, she snapped her fingers, and the young girl that had been watching the door sauntered over. Sarah, show my guest to Deborah's old room. He'll be staying there for the night. He'll need a bath, some fresh sheets, and that bottle of wine and plate of food I asked for earlier. Dantes coughed. Any chance that could be a deluxe bath? Vera laughed in a way that could make any man she hadn't helped raise blush. What happened to you being too tired? He shrugged. Some things a man finds the energy for if it's been long enough. Ah, well, you have been at sea for 5 years. She looked at Sarah. If you wouldn't mind, dear. Dantes shot her a subtle look. Oh, that's right. I forgot that you're one of those strange men that prefers women his own age. They'll have a lessa come to run the bath. Sarah looked a tad relieved, as if Shed believed he may have been planning to treat her as harshly as Shed treated him at the door, though she had nothing to worry about. Dantes coughed again. Any chance the deluxe bath could be an ultra-deluxe bath? Vera let out a long sigh. You're reaching the limits of my hospitality, but fine. They'll have Alessa, and Tyra is sent up to help you with your bath. Dante smiled. Thank you. He found himself floating above a familiar scene. There was a long table with a scale in the center of it and a number of coins on either side of it. The woman in green was in her same place, but now her chair was twice the height as the smirking man in blues and had morphed from a chair into something more tree-like. She wore an even more predatory smile than before, with fearsome fangs showing and just the smallest trickle of saliva dribbling down her chin. The rat was now in her lap, gnawing on a silver coin while she roughly scratched his back with long claw-like fingernails. As Dantes looked at her chair, he saw a number of roaches climbing around and into it. The man in blue was leaning back in his chair and looking up at the woman in green with the same slight smile Head had since the beginning. Even though his head was now tilted up, though, it was still impossible to see higher up on his face. It seemed that his side of the scale was starting to rise at the weight of coins the woman in green had placed on the side, but he showed no indication of concern. The man in black and gold was leaning close to the man in blue, whispering in his ear. In his hand, he was holding a heavy pile of gold coins that he seemed to be offering to the man in blue, but he had the cruel smile of a usurer, and anything the man in blue took would clearly come at a price. Dantes felt an unusual presence on his shoulder and looked to see Jacopo's golden eyes staring back at him. They regarded one another silently for a moment, and Dantes tried to communicate with him, but found himself unable to. It didn't really matter, he supposed, and they shared a shrug and returned their attention to the table. The green woman took the silver coin from the rat and flipped it expertly toward the scale. While it was in the air, the man in blue feigned a yawn and slipped a coin from the man in black's pile, which he then pretended to pull from his cloak and place on the scale, leaving it tilted just ever so slightly in the green woman's favor. The man in blue turned subtly toward Dantes, and for a moment, the slight smile seemed to be... Dantes woke up on the floor. Head moved there at some point during the night, when Head found the bed too soft to sleep on. He took a deep breath and took in his surroundings. Light coming in through the windows, the sleeping forms of an orc and a dwarf softly snoring in his bed, and Jacopo less than a foot from his face loudly chewing some leftover sweetmeats. "Been awake long?" he asked, not out loud since he didn't want to wake Alessa and Tyra, rather through the connection they shared. "Several hours. I didn't need the same rest you did." Dantes stood and stretched. He was sore, but his spirits were high. His stomach was full, and had enjoyed a satisfaction Head last experienced with Mercedes more than 5 years before. "Been eating the whole time?" Jacopo shrugged. "Much of it. The food is much better up here. The sights and smells are different too. The light," though Jacopo squinted as he looked out the window. "It will be much harder to hide." Dantes nodded. "Don't worry. If we're doing any sneaking, it will still be at night, for the most part." Dantes walked over to where Head placed his pack and pulled out the grave rob clothes Head purchased the previous day, slipping them on. They were a good fit. One of the benefits of being so average in size was that most of the clothes he stole or bought tended to fit him fairly well. He looked over at the soiled clothes from the last day, his eyes lingering on his coat. He had shivs, random coins, spider fangs, stolen baubles, seed from his garden, and Televor's finger inside of it. The coat had served him well for the entire time he was in prison, but now it was soiled beyond belief and riddled in holes of all kinds, including several which he could tell were from Jacopo's board gnawing. I need a new coat at the very least. The dagger Head taken from the elves was in rough shape as well, but not so bad a blacksmith couldn't repair it, or Dantes himself with a whetstone and some time. On top of new equipment, Head need to figure out a new source of favor from the god of rats and the god of roaches. He looked at his arm. Some additional favor had trickled into both of them, likely from the garden and the Orcish corpses Head left in his wake. But now that he wasn't the one granting permission to use the garden, he wasn't sure if Head continue receiving favor when they found themselves some rotting fruit on the ground to eat. He also was disappointed his dream had been of the strange figures again rather than a meeting with the god of bats. He grabbed one of the sweetmeats on the plate, then a piece of cheese, then 2 crackers before putting the whole thing in his mouth to chew. He reached out his senses, seeing how far he could send them. He could feel rats sleeping in the dark recesses of alleyways and inside walls, roaches, silverfish, pigeons and crows on the roofs surrounding him, weeds valiantly fighting to grow through concrete and cobblestone, small pots of flowers near death or strong and thriving, depending on who was caring for them. And at the very edge of his senses, he could feel a small shipment of fish from the dock with several of them clinging to life as they suffocated beneath the corpses of their fellows. He almost choked on his food as the information flooded him, and began coughing until he was able to drink some water to finish choking it down. He heard stirring front heap bed and looked over to see Tierra and Alessa yawning and stretching languidly. Dantes took another sip of water to clear his throat. "Sorry about that. Didn't mean to wake you." Tyra brushed her long, curly hair from her face and scratched her head. "It's all right. We shouldn't have slept in so much anyway. Madam gets pissy if we miss breakfast." She slid off the bed and began searching for her clothes. She was a dwarf, and so stood more than a foot shorter than Dantes, but was a bit broader. Dantes watched her move around appreciatively. Alessa began to sit up too and began coughing. This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. Dantes poured a second glass of water and brought it to her. She took it gratefully and cleared her throat. She was an orc and had her dark hair loose, but it was cut short, not even reaching her shoulders. Her tusks made a kind of clinking sound as they touched the edges of the glass. She was very slender for an orc and quite elegant, with bright orange eyes that always seemed half-lidded. "Thank you," she said as she put the glass down. "No worries," said Dantes. Moving over to his makeshift pack, he found his coins and counted them out. Then moved over to Tyra, who was taking her time adjusting her blouse. He held out 4 silver to her. "I'm not sure what the rate is, but this should cover it." She shook her head, her curls bouncing a bit at the gesture. "No need. The madam told us it was on the house, since you're a friend of hers and a guest." Dantes shook his head. "I know. This is just for you and your time. You don't have to pay any of it up to her." Tyra shrugged and slipped the coins into her pocket. He then walked over to Alessa and handed her some coins as well. "Why?" she asked simply. "My mom was a whore. I always pay whores what they deserve. I know it's a hard job." She coughed again, still clearing her throat. "I'm actually a singer. I'm just working here until I find better work." Dante smiled. "Well, we'll call this payment for being able to hear your vocal exercises last night." Fake or not, they were quite pleasant. Tyra and Alessa both chuckled at that, and Alessa took the coins that Head offered, though she had to put them on the small side table since she hadn't gotten dressed yet. Now, what was that about breakfast? As Dantes walked downstairs making light conversation with Tyra and Alessa, he smelled cooking meat and his mouth began to water. Cheese, crackers, sweetmeats, and wine were a welcome treat, but a fully cooked meal, the thought of it nearly brought a tear to his eye. Had it novel been at? The bottom floor of the vivacious Vixen had transformed in the daylight. The pink curtains that had been lining the walls were all drawn to reveal the plain wormwood behind them. There were 2 tables lined up, each seating nearly 10 people. Dantes saw Decker and Sarah, and then he saw Zilly walk from the kitchen behind the bar carrying a plate of heavy sausage and another of roast pigeon. There was already bread and jam on the bar, as well as plates and forks stacked to the side, like a buffet. Dantes looked around, but didn't see Vera, and so went to the bar to get himself a plate. He could feel Jacopo's hunger in his right pocket as well, a mirror and an amplifier of his own. He noticed some stares in his direction from a few of the ladies, but he didn't bother introducing himself. In places like the Vixen, everyone would know everything everyone else knew about him by the time he sat down. With his plate stacked high, he moved to sit in an empty space next to Decker and across from Sarah, where he began tucking in with abandon, only pausing to either drink or pass small pieces of sausage to Jacopo in his pocket. "I thought for a moment you might be a third mate after seeing you in clean clothes and freshly bathed, but you definitely eat more like a cabin boy," said Sarah. Dante smiled. "I'm a captain actually got a crew of thousands and a ship faster than the breeze. Food on it is shit, though, so it's nice to have a good meal for a change." "I don't believe you're a captain. You shouldn't, it's a lie. A very obvious one." "It's okay. I made simple observations when I was a child, too." Sarah blushed slightly. She wasn't as good at taking insults as she was giving them, but Dantes had been raised by a whore and sometimes a sailor, so he was quite adept at both. "You were close, though. I'm just a deckhand." The lie let her regain a bit of composure and solidified his backstory. Does Vera not typically eat breakfast with you? Normally she does, but she's off to get a priest for our monthly cleansings. Dantes nodded. The best whorehouses were able to hire a priest on a routine basis to cleanse anything the girls may have picked up. The vixens seemed to be thriving under Vera. She asked me to tell you to wait to head out until she got back, said Decker, his voice a soothing baritone. Thanks for passing that along, and for the wine recommendation. It was great. You must have a very refined sense of taste. Dantes was just buttering him up and being obvious about doing so, but Decker smiled and nodded anyway. That being said, I won't be waiting for her. Let her know I'll be back by noon, though, particularly if Zilly is cooking lunch as well. He shot a wink to her, which she returned with a nod, but no change in expression. She was wearing blue trousers and a red shirt this time, and her muddy blonde hair was in an orderly bun on her head. He made a note to himself to try and make her laugh. Something told him it would be worth the effort. He stood up and went back up to his room, gathering his things into a bag. He scooted the bed to the side and pried a floorboard up with his knife. In that compartment, he hid everything he was planning on leaving there. The Vixen was a nice enough, but a whorehouse was still not a good place to leave valuables laying around. He'd get some new clothes and equipment and see what he and Jacopo could learn about what was happening in the city. Dantes stepped out of the Vixen and took a deep breath, savoring the slight taste of salt in the air and the morning breeze whistling through the alleyways. He hadn't felt a breeze in a long time. It wasn't something you realized you'd missed until you felt it again. He pulled up the hood on the grave-robbed tunic to both hide his face and keep his ears warm, and began walking toward Needle Street at Novel Benedat. The first thing he wanted was a new jacket. He felt naked without one, and handicapped without the many hidden pockets he was used to. The long-sleeved tunic and simple trousers Head bought weren't enough to keep him from feeling exposed. He wasn't even able to properly hide his dagger, and had to wear it on his hip. Not that that was uncommon, but Head always preferred an unseen blade to a seen one. He began walking, but when he made it a few alleys down, he felt Jacopo squirm and leap from his pocket. Jacopo shook himself and fixed his whiskers. That pocket is not as comfortable as the ones I'm used to, and there are no holes to look out of. I'm on the way to buy a new jacket now, if you can stick it out. You can always just look through my eyes. Jacopo shook his head. No, I need to see the city for myself. Taste the air, feel the warmth of the sun, eat the morsels lining the streets. Dantes nodded. All right, be careful. There are cats up here, and other predators you may not be used to. If you get lost, the map I have in my head shouldn't be far off. I will not get lost. I will stay in touch. With that, Dantes watched him scurry away, his furry brown form sliding into a crack in a wall and disappearing. Dantes couldn't blame him. He could feel the excitement radiating from Jacopo as he moved. Dantes began moving in the opposite direction. There were a few tailors' head known in Midtown, as well as smiths and working mages who could help him out with what he needed, but he didn't want to risk showing his face there until he had more information. News traveled faster there than anywhere else in Rendhold, and while he could trust Vera, he knew the rumor mill in Midtown would start turning if any of his other acquaintances saw him. He started by moving through main streets, but as they filled with other people going about their mornings, he could feel his heart speed up and his eyes beginning to dart to and fro. Eventually, he moved to take alleys, and he slowly calmed down. He was no longer used to streets filled with so many people. The busiest day in the undermarket was nothing compared to the average Rendhold Street, on which thousands could walk every day. Once Head regained his composure, he forced himself back onto the main streets, taking small cuts through the alleys when he felt he needed to. Head keep doing it until the discomfort didn't exist for him anymore or shrank into something that could be ignored. He passed through one more alley on the way to the tip of Needle Street, and as he passed a man, some kind of mutt like him stepped out from behind a pile of trash and lifted a sharp kitchen knife toward him. "Your money or your life," said the man. His pupils were heavily dilated and his breathing rapid. He was high. "Oh, okay. No problem," said Dantes, shaking as he reached for his coin purse. He held out his hand, holding it, but dropped it just before the mugger could grab it. "Sorry," the mugger grunted and bent over to grab the coin purse from the ground. Dantes took that opportunity to drive his boot into the man's face, throwing him backward into the same trash head stepped out from behind. He picked his coin purse back up and kicked the knife, which the man had dropped, across the alley. He smiled widely. This is almost as good a welcome as I got from Vera. He muttered to himself. He bent down to go through the man's pockets. He put up some slight resistance, but Dantes simply struck him a few more times, and he gave up. Once he was done, he found a few copper rings with cheap stones, a handful of copper, and a single silver. This is actually a pretty solid haul for muggings. You probably should have taken it to your dealer sooner. Could have gotten a hit or two off of half this. He tucked the coins and rings into his pockets and purse. For the record, you'd have better luck toward the middle of the needle. Down on this, and you're more likely to run into a rougher class of people. The man groaned in response. One more thing. Dante drove his foot into the man's ribs one last time, and the man was winded and struggling to breathe on top of everything else. Dantes whistled lightly, pausing only to say a quick prayer to the god of thieves. Full pockets, quick wits, quicker blades, and the Lord's luck. He walked out of the alley, sending a message to nearby rats and roaches that a hurt man with some exposed flesh was ripe for them to take a few nibbles from. Then he started walking up Needle Street. This tale has been pilfered from Royal Road. If found on Amazon, kindly file a report. The street was busy, but Dantes fought down his discomfort as he began walking down it, catching snippets of conversations as he moved. Giant tree. 200 prisoners escaped. Guard managed to keep all the prisoners locked down. Hope any got out. That girl lied to get him thrown down there. Need to pay guard for some extra walk-bys. It seemed that news of what had happened was starting to spread, though he could tell a lot of it wasn't accurate. The guard was probably trying to keep things tapped down as much as possible, but with his method of escape, it was probably a hard thing to keep a lid on. At the thinnest point of the needle were the resellers and small-time tailors who didn't finish their apprenticeships or were more self-taught. They were more able to patch a pair of pants than to mend them, but their price point was low enough that those without family to rely on had a place to go. Their shops were either unlabeled or had crudely written signs simply saying tailor, or in one unfortunate case tail wore, though seeing what the elderly seamstress sitting in front of the store was wearing, that may have been on purpose. Dantes ignored all of those on the low end, only really looking once he reached the center of the needle, where it began widening. It was at that point that he saw a smaller shop, squeezed so tightly between two other buildings that the sign could barely fit the words, tailor and reseller, in a straight line. Dantes walked inside, the door creaking as he did so. The building was longer than it was wide by a large margin, and its narrowness was further emphasized by clothes hung along the both walls all the way down to the other end of the shop, where a bored-looking young man with spectacles sat reading. Dantes ran his fingers along the clothes as he moved. He didn't exactly have access to nice fabrics in the pit, and the touch of fine cotton, wool, and even silk was worth savoring. He made note of a few pieces as he walked, until he reached the desk. The book the man was reading was The Dragon's Heat, and featured a lurid picture of an underdressed woman in the clutches of red talons etched on the front. Despite the obviousness of the book's content, the young man was holding it up in front of his face without even a hint of shame, clearly engrossed in every word. Dantes lightly knocked on the desk to get his attention. He sighed and put the book down, looking Dantes up and down. Huh, you're almost perfectly average-sized. That's not what your mother told me. What? Nothing, just wondering if you have any long coats, medium weight, lots of pockets, easy to alter, dark color. The young man blinked a few times, clearly readjusting to reality after spending so much time engrossed in his book. Dantes had seen the look many times before when walking through collar territory. There's a few pieces that may work. The man stood and began walking down the long line of clothes, checking an item here and there, and pulling a few pieces before returning to the desk at the far end and laying them out. Once he had them all down, he put his head back into his book. Dantes looked at the coats. They were high quality, more so than he'd expect at this part of the needle. How did you get all this inventory? He asked, curious. The man didn't look up from his book. I buy unfinished and unpaid for pieces from the tailors at the wide end at a large discount and finish them before upselling them. Dantes looked back at the coats. He was no tailor, but he knew a bit about sewing and mending. Vera and his mother had taught him when all of his trousers started to get holes at the knees, and when heads started stealing, and they thought him knowing how to sew extra pockets would be helpful. He couldn't tell that any of the coats were finished by different tailors. The stitching all matched perfectly for what he could see. Dantes wondered what a tailor as talented as the young man was doing as a reseller. But considering how happy Head looked flipping through his book, perhaps he had other priorities. Dantes went through the coats. There was a dark blue one, but he found the material too stiff to move comfortably in. He found a black one, but the sleeves were oddly short, which made them useless for him considering how he liked to hide his knives. He sorted through a few more before coming upon one in green. It was so dark that it was almost black, and the material was firm, but easy to move in, and on the inside it already had a half-dozen pockets of various sizes sewn into it. He slipped it on and found it to be a near-perfect fit. "How much for this one?" he asked. The man peeked from over the top of his book. "Ah, the old noble gardener's coat. That one's been here for a long while. Let's say 1 gold, 3 silver. Dantes smiled. That was robbery even for a coat like that. "How about 1 gold, and I put these other coats back for you?" The man looked at the coats, then Dantes, then his book. "Fine, 1 gold it is." Dantes pulled a single gold coin from his pockets and slid it over to him. "It may have been cheaper without the comment about my mother," said the young man, not looking up from his book as he slid the gold coin back across the table. Dantes smiled. "Fair enough." He turned around and started to put the coats back, slipping a few shirts and a pair of pants into the folds of his new coat as he did so. The young man never even looked up from his book as he did so. By the time Dantes had walked out, had gotten more than his gold's worth. He could have simply stolen the coat as well, but had decided against it. A robbery in broad daylight was too risky, but some petty shoplifting? That was an easy risk to take. Dantes walked out and rearranged his stolen goods in his makeshift pack in an alley before making his way further up the needle to an old shortcut he remembered to the docks. He made his way down, still in a good mood, when he saw a woman at the far end of the street. She was tall and lean, with long dark hair up in what he guessed was a fashionable style. She was wearing a dark red dress with black accents, and even at the distance he was from her, he could see the twinkle of expensive jewelry on her neck and ears. She was much like him, with a mix of just about everything you could think of, but she seemed to get only the best features from each bloodline that was mixed in. The fairness of elves, thick lustrous hair of a dwarf, and the lean muscle of an orc. In spite of that, she could still easily pass for human. It had been 5 years, and she was certainly dressing differently than she had back before it had been tossed in the underprison, but had recognized Mercedes anywhere. Dantes pulled up his hood and started walking down the street, keeping an eye on Mercedes from a distance. 2 large men were following behind her, each of them carrying boxes and bags of what Dantes guessed were new clothes and jewelry. Mercedes had always had expensive tastes, but in the past Shed had to steal to satisfy them. Now it didn't seem like that was necessary. She walked with a confident saunter, other pedestrians parting like fish in front of shark, until she ran into a woman who didn't move out of her way. Dantes couldn't hear them over the din of the crowd in the distance, but he knew Mercedes' body language. She was telling the other woman off. The woman stood and listened to Mercedes calmly. She was middle-aged and wearing a fine dress. She had the bearing of born and bred nobility. Once Mercedes was done talking, she spoke a short sentence and walked away. Mercedes blushed red enough that Dantes could see it even from a distance, and tilted her head forward slightly. The woman she was speaking to nodded at her, and calmly walked away, up the needle toward uptown, where it was clear she belonged. Dantes noticed 2 men subtly falling in line behind her. Trained soldiers and killers in sharp contrast to the obvious rough thugs that Mercedes had with her. Dantes enjoyed watching Mercedes' discomfort, until she suddenly turned to look in his direction. He turned his head subtly and engaged with a market stall selling scarves for a few moments, waiting until he felt her eyes move away from him. Her senses had always been sharp, and they were particularly sensitive when people were witnessing her embarrassment. He would need to be more careful if he was going to keep following her. He didn't have a plan. Seeing her was too short notice for that, but he felt compelled to keep tailing her. He could feel the chipped dagger on his waist, weight hanging heavy. If he was still in the underprison, he could simply walk up to her and drive it into her heart before running away. It wasn't an option here, and even if it was, he felt that would be too easy. He didn't want her and his former gang members to simply die. He wanted them to suffer. He wanted them to know they'd lost to him before they died, and that it was him that beat them. He fell back in the crowd a bit, creating some distance between them. He checked the marks on his arm. He had less than a third of a fong on his rat mark, and a quarter of a wing on the roach mark. He looked up as a small flock of pigeons fluttering overhead, dropping a small payload on a poor woman who seemed to have just purchased a new hat. Being able to track people from the air, or even move products that way, would be a real boon. Once he figured out his current favor woes, he'd need to turn his attention in that direction. Bats may have their own uses, but only at night. He reached out and found a few small colonies of roaches nesting nearby. He reached out to 5 of them and had them make their way toward Mercedes. 2 died almost immediately, but the other 3 made it to her. Another got crunched beneath her feet as it tried to scale her boots, but the last of them made it all the way to the hem of her dress and hid himself amidst its folds. Dantes couldn't track humans, dwarves, elves, kobolds, or any combination of them with his abilities. The roach, though, had been able to sense over a fairly significant distance based on his experiences in the pit. He cursed himself slightly for not coming up with the trick sooner. Tracking people with individual roaches connected to him was far easier and more cost-effective with favor than using rats had been. Then again, he couldn't get as full of a picture from the roaches. He looked at his wrists and saw the roach mark had trickled ever lower. He followed Mercedes slowly from there on, picking up a whetstone and a few other odds and ends when she stopped at different tailors and shops of her own. By the time she was done, Dantes could see, even from a great distance, that the thugs with her were now struggling under the sheer weight of goods that Shed purchased. They began to head back down the narrower end of the needle, eventually cutting across streets and starting to head toward Midtown. Dantes was able to continue tracking them, even when they walked down near empty streets, thanks to the roach. But once they reached the edge of Midtown, he had a decision to make. He could continue following them as he was, doing his best to be just another inconspicuous mutt, or he could become a rat and stay more subtle, but be at a higher risk from just about everything. In the end, he chose the third option and went around Midtown, making his way back to the docks while focusing on maintaining the connection he had to the roach. If you spot this tale on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. There was no reason to rush to get the information he needed. She and Mondego had made themselves very conspicuous in not only Midtown, but the entire city. There was no reason to risk himself when their locations and activities could be common knowledge. Had taken some aggressive risks down in the pit, where his life had less value, but now that he was out, and after experiencing the consequences of those kinds of risks, he needed to focus on caution. He wasn't the only one that could come to harm if he wasn't careful. He waited until the roach came to a stop and tried to figure out where exactly Mercedes was, laying his mental map of Midtown out and then placing the distance he felt with the roach on top of it. He thought for a moment, the old manor, a dilapidated house from a better time before Midtown had gone to shit. They'd used it as a safe house on more than one occasion, laying low after jobs. Dantes clenched his jaw, feeling his small tusks press against the inside of his cheeks again. Another piece of his history taken from him. Did Mondego do anything original? When he finally confronted him, would he become a rat too, and they'd have to fight to the death in a soup bowl? He looked up above the building to see the sun high in the sky. It was approaching mid-afternoon. Vera had asked that he be back at the Vixen by then, but he had one more stop. He began walking through the docks, past the nicer portion that contained the higher-end brothels and bars for officers, through the fish market, and into the small collection of general shops maintained just within the docks. For the most part, shopping was located in the central market near Uptown or in the Guild District, which Needle Street was a part of. Every part of the city had its own shops, though, Rendhold's sheer size making it a necessity to have at least a general store every few miles or so. The docks had their own full market, so that sailors on short leave could quickly get personal goods before leaving back out to sea. They tended to be a bit seedy, but that was Dante's preference. Head heard from the shop owner that had sold him a whetstone, needle, thread, and a new pack, that there was an enchanter at the docks who did cheap and discreet work. An academy flunky that had somehow maintained an authorization to use enchantment magic. It wasn't hard to find the storefront. His fingertips began tingling as he approached it. The building was purple, and instead of clever signage, it simply said cheap enchantments done here on a sign outside. At novel been at. Dantes pushed his way inside, a bell at the top of the door jingling as he walked inside. Just a moment, and it'll get to you, came a voice from deeper inside. And if you try to steal anything, I'll know. No worries there. I hadn't been planning on it, lied Dantes as he walked deeper into the store. There were large shelves and a central table on which a number of different items were displayed, most of them with a nautical theme. There were compasses that possessed their own dull glow, making them visible in the dark, small leather pouches that emanated with heat for sailors' pockets, so they could keep their hands warm in their pockets, and a large number of scrimshaws that, when touched, shifted from being images of boats to images of women in compromising positions. Dantes had received one such scrimshaw from his father when he reached his 12th year. Had lived with his mother at the Welcoming Embrace in Midtown at the time, so he was distinctly unimpressed. Nude women weren't exactly novel to him. As he was eyeing a necklace with a bone carving of an eye that blinked every few seconds, he heard movement from the store, and a short, squat man with a thick beard and a few sailing tattoos peeking from mage robes appeared, with a scrimshaw in his hand which he placed on a nearby shelf, a few small purple sparks coming off of it as he did so. "So, mate, you need something particular, or just here to browse the scrims? It's fine since the day's been slow. Just for the love of the gods, please keep your pants on while you're here." Dantes walked into the Vixen with Jacopo tucked comfortably in one of his new jacket's pockets. In the entryway, Alessa was leaning sultrily against a wall, her half-lidded orange eyes glancing up at him slowly. "Oh, Edmund, I thought you were a customer. Well, the day's not over yet." She chuckled, and that turned to a cough. Dantes politely waited for her to finish. "You all right?" She nodded. "Just a stubborn cough. It was a bit better after the priest left, but it always seems to come back. They'll get you some water from a bar. You'll lose customers if they hear you cough too much." She seemed about to argue, but was forced to stifle another cough instead. Dantes walked into the Vixen proper, passing Decker, who was tapping on a particularly boisterous patron's shoulder. The soft pink and purple curtains had been put back up, and the table that they'd eaten breakfast at that morning removed. There were a few customers drinking and chatting with the girls who were doing a good job of pretending to be interested in what they had to say. He felt a small pang of empathy for Sarah, who was pretending to laugh at a young sailor's "bring me my brown pants" joke, as if she had never heard it before. Another sailor was talking to Tyra, who was sitting in his lap. "Yeah, they locked down everything even close to the Underprison. Heard it from a merchant whose cargo we were loading. No one knows what's going on, but he swears he saw a giant tree in that direction." "Wow, that's so interesting," said Tyra, sounding far more bubbly than she had at breakfast. "Don't worry, though," said the sailor. "It'll protect you." "I'm sure you will, with those strong arms," she said, giving his wiry bicep a squeeze. Dantes stifled a chuckle at that. Had heard whores be subtle, and had heard them be as blatant as Tyra was, and in both cases, the men rarely noticed that they were being manipulated. He anticipated she'd be making good money that day. The information Head mentioned about the Underprison was also interesting. It seemed like the guard was trying to maintain calm about what had happened, but how long would that last with a massive tree growing in that direction? He wondered if Mondego knew yet, and found himself torn about it. He wanted the element of surprise, but he also wanted to make him afraid. When he reached the bar, Zilly was already pouring chilled water into a glass. Dantes nodded at her, and she nodded back. Head needed to be wary of her. Her ears seemed keen, even for an elf. He walked back and handed the glass to Alessa, who took it gratefully. Then he started to walk back toward the bar. Decker stopped him. "The madam wants to see you. She was expecting you some time ago." Dantes shrugged. "Lost track of time. He'll eat something, then head up." The madam insisted. "I will have Zilly bring you something." Dantes sighed. All right. Had been on a mind to meet more of the girls, or trying to get Zilly to share a drink with him. He knew objectively he had more practical things to do, but had missed women for a long time, and it would probably take him some time to not make trying to get their attention by coin or by wit a priority. Decker nodded and moved back toward the front door. At least he wasn't made to escort him all the way up the stairs. Dantes knocked twice when he reached Vera's door. "Come in, Edmund." He smirked. She had always had that talent. Could recognize anyone from their footsteps. He walked in and closed the door. "I believe ID left word that ID return at noon and wanted you to wait for me?" "You did, and your people faithfully gave me the message." "You do know I was only asking for your own safety?" "I do, but did you expect me to stay inside? I've been cooped up for far too long to just sit around. I foolishly believe that remaining in a building full of beautiful women and a soft bed may be enough enticement for you." "Almost." She sighed and gripped the bridge of her nose with both fingers. Dantes laughed and pulled the necklace head just bought from Dario from his coat pocket. "Here, Andy. This is for you as an apology. Don't worry, I only went to the Needle and then to a store here on the docks. I kept my face hidden and did my best not to make a fuss. Unauthorized tail usage. If you spot this story on Amazon, report the violation." She took the necklace, watching it blink at her a few times, and placed it gently back on the desk. "Your time in the Underprison changed you." Dantes sat down on the chair across from her. "Really?" She nodded. "Yes, really. 5 years ago, you would have gone straight to Midtown and tried to run Mondego through then and there. He'll get what he deserves, but I don't want to die in the process." She nodded. "I told you I'd tell you what you wanted to hear today." He nodded. It was a statement more than a question. "Your gang, I didn't know what they'd done to you at first. I would see Mercedes, Danglars, and Mondego sometimes and we'd chat. They even seemed to be grieving you." Dantes grimaced at that. "And Gaspard?" She shook her head. "I saw him once. He tried to trade her name for some free time with the girls. It was after ID found out what happened, so I had him beaten and thrown in the gutter." Dantes nodded. "I found out what they'd done when I never received any letters back from you that I sent through the consortium. I did some digging and found out that Mondego had paid to have it prevented." Dantes clenched his teeth, gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Having him thrown down into the pit, paying to prevent letters being sent, and paying to make sure he could never leave. The consortium had made quite a lot of money from Mondego's hate of him. Do you know why? Why they did it? Why they would do what they did?" She shook her head. "No, I have no idea. Where are they now? Mondego and Mercedes are married. From what I've heard, they control nearly all the smuggling from the docks into the city. The fingers have taken notice of them." Dantes knew that already from his conversations with the Shadow Cats, but having it confirmed didn't exactly improve his mood. The fingers were the 5 families that ran the city. Generally, they controlled a section of the city, along with having a major controlling interest in some vice, but there was a lot of overlap in what they dealt with. They worked together to control the vast underbelly of the city, allowing smaller gangs to duke it out over the crumbs that remained. To gain their notice was more often a bad thing than a good one. "How about Danglars? That is a strange one. Did you know he had noble blood?" "What?" Dantes nearly rose from his chair. "Yes, he is the son of a councilwoman's cousin. They weren't rich or anything, but they lived in the lowest part of uptown." Dantes thought through his interaction with Danglars. He was a degenerate through and through. Gambling, whoring, drugs, he did it all. He could read and write, and he spoke a bit more formally than was normal, but Dantes had never questioned that he was scum, through and through, just like he was. Once he were in the prison, he seemed to change remarkably quickly. He traded on his family name, and is now a magister of the lower court. Dantes was almost too surprised to be angry for a moment, before he realized that if Danglars had those kinds of connections, it was very probable he could have gotten Dantes sentenced to forced labor rather than the pit. They didn't just throw anyone into the underprison. It was for murderers, rapists, political enemies, repeat offenders, the worst of the worst. Had attacked a councilman's wagon, so that was more than enough to justify him being thrown down there. But 5 years of forced labor in the camps and fields outside the city, or even being sold to a ship in need of crew, all of that would have afforded him more options than the pit. More freedom, more of a life. And as I mentioned before, last I saw Gaspard, I had him beaten and thrown in the gutter. I think I did hear something about him doing jobs in Midtown still, but he hasn't had the success of the rest of your fellows." Dantes sat silently for a few moments. It was a good overview Shed given him. He had the information he needed to get started, but still needed more specifics, and he needed the right tools for the job. Gold would help, as would a new source of favor, and perhaps a new God's blessing. There was a knock on the door. Vera shifted her expression from grave to pleasant, and Dantes adjusted his body language to mirror it. "Come in, Zilly." The woman walked in, carrying a plate of hot sliced meat, veggies, and bread. She walked over to them and handed it to Dantes, who took it gratefully. The smell of it reminded him immediately of the fact that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. "I was just expecting some cold meat and bread." "Thank you." She nodded. "Welcome," and walked out of the room. Dantes resisted looking at her as she walked away, grabbing a piece of meat and placing it on a slice of bread. Vera looked at him with an eyebrow raised. "In a whorehouse, you pick the one woman with a different profession to have an infatuation with." Dantes kept a straight face, swallowing his first bite before speaking. "No idea what you mean, Annie." "Sure, dear." She moved to start her kettle and ready some tea as he ate. "There was another reason I wanted to talk to you. I know I said you'd be able to stay free as long as you need, but it turns out I may need you to do some work for me." "Oh," asked Dantes. "Decker needs to take the afternoons at home to help his father. I want you to act as our bouncer for the first part of the day." Dantes laughed. "I'm not exactly as intimidating as Decker." Vera nodded. "True, but you're not exactly welcoming looking either. Decker actually signaled to Sarah to tell me that you may be a serious threat when she went to tell me you were here." Dantes raised an eyebrow. He was dangerous, but he was also just under 2/3 Decker's size, though he was certainly more muscular than had been when he went into the pit, thanks to Merle's tips. He spared a moment to think of them. He left them all the tools they needed to control the pit, and he hoped he wasn't the only one to escape, but had done all he could at the time. At least that's what he told himself. "It's risky for me, Annie." She nodded. "I know, but the city's big, and I haven't seen anyone you know around here in quite some time." He thought about it for a moment. It was risky, but he wanted to help out if he could. Didn't want to leave the help she'd given her unreciprocated. He could also post a roach or a rat outside to make sure that it wasn't anyone he knew approaching. "I could do the job, Annie, as long as I have the nights to myself and early mornings. Temporarily, of course." "That's fine." Decker's mother would normally take care of his father, but she needed to take extra seasonal work in hopes that they could save enough for a healer. "What's wrong with his dad?" She shook her head. "Saddest thing, he was crippled by a kobold of all things. Had 4 different chairs smashed over his back." Dantes swallowed his food, keeping his expression neutral as he remembered Mez telling him about the fight that had gotten him thrown into the underprison. Dantes woke the next day next to Alessa and carefully got out of the bed so as not to wake her. She hadn't wound up with much business, so he decided to help her out. He certainly had no motive of his own in the transaction. It was purely charitable. He poured a glass of water for her and placed it by her on the side table. It was too early for even breakfast, but his body was still trained on his habit of rising early in the pit and jumping right into his usual activities. Had been too exhausted that first night for a number of reasons, but today he felt good, strong even. He squinted at that thought. It had only been a day since his escape. Had run, jumped, fought, and climbed that day to an incredibly exhausting degree. He should still be worn down and likely too tired to get out of bed, even with the better quality food and drink he had been having since Head gotten out of the pit. Even in the pit itself, Head recovered more quickly from injury and exercise than he had before. Head chalked it up to his improved access to food then too, but something else was going on. He reached out his senses, feeling all the life around himself. There were pigeons nesting on the roof and feeding hungry chicks. Jacopo was stirring from a spot under the bed where Head dragged Dante's old rags to use as a bed. There were a number of roaches in the walls, and he could feel that at least one of the girls had a number of flowers growing in her room that seemed well cared for. He brought his attention back to himself. He couldn't sense other people, but he could sense his own life, burning brightly in his perceptions. He unfocused a bit, and saw a number of small threads. The thickest of them was connected directly to Jacopo. There were several that were simply reaching for nearby living things that had just sensed thin, wispy lines seeking connection. Then there were a number of woven threads extending through the walls. He followed them as far as he could, but eventually reached his limit and pulled his attention back. It wasn't hard to figure out where they led. It was back to the prison, and all the life had connected to there. He remembered the feeling when he had first planted the seeds in his garden and watched them grow. The feeling as if the energy within himself that he expended toward them was being returned somehow. He let out a quiet sigh and moved to get dressed. He didn't mind the many advantages he received from his abilities, but he wished there was some kind of guide or another druid to speak to. He put seeking one out toward the top of the ever-expanding list of necessities he maintained in his mind. Once he was dressed, he belted his freshly cleaned and sharpened dagger to his belt and threw on his new jacket. Jacopo crawled out from under the bed and climbed onto and into his jacket. No food is being prepared downstairs yet. Dantes nodded. No, we'll come back for breakfast. I need to do a bit of scouting first. Jacopo squeaked a confirmation, and they crept out of the room and downstairs, hearing only faint snoring as they made their way down. Zilly was there, her sleeves rolled halfway up and a mop in her hands, which she moved in simple practiced motion down the floor. She noticed him at the foot of the stairs and gave him a silent nod. He smiled and gave her a wink, peeling off his boots to not immediately dirty the freshly cleaned floor and making his way to the door. Wait, she whispered. He complied, watching her as she moved back behind the bar and into the kitchen, where she returned with a small sack made of a napkin which Shed tied together. Dantes took it, nodding appreciatively, and slipped out onto the stoop, slipping his boots back up and making his way down the street. He wore a light smile as he opened the napkin, finding a warm piece of bread, a cold slice of meat, and a few dry pieces of mango. He ate as he walked, handing a bit of the bread to Jacopo as his head peeked out from his shoulder at the smell of the food. You like that woman? So far. Could you not simply purchase the use of a different one? I could, and likely will again. If you encounter this tale on Amazon, note that it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. And yet you prefer to pursue this woman? For now, I'm mostly just being polite. Pursuit is something different entirely. Jacopo continued munching on bread near his ear, knowing Dantes had dodged the question. Dantes sighed. There's nothing wrong with buying a woman for the night, but earning a woman's affection is more fun. Could you not earn the affections of one of the women you already purchased time with? Dantes shrugged. None of them are my type. And what is your type? So far? The madam my mother worked for when I was 14, a woman who married the man that betrayed me, a dwarven noblewoman with a smile like birdsong, and Zilly. Dantes could sense Jacopo searching his mind for more about the women Head mentioned, and gave the rat equivalent of a frown. These women all look completely different from one another. Dantes shrugged. I take things on a case-by-case basis. I like what I like, at it novel been at. Things worked out with none of these women. You did not even touch two of them. I said they were my type, not that I was theirs. Anyway, it's not the focus right now. And what is? Finding a new garden. Jacopo nodded, taking a piece of mango, and burrowed back into the jacket to make a mess of his preferred pocket. Dantes walked for a half an hour before he reached what he was looking for. There was a large wooden barrier erected, blocking off a few hundred feet of the city. It was unguarded, as they always were, and the signs that had been placed in front of it were worn and faded. These were common in Rendhold. The city was expanding ever outward, and in the process, whole blocks of the city would fall behind in repair and maintenance. Eventually, there was a building collapse, an outbreak of disease, or even a witch's curse in a section of the city would be sealed off. They'd be monitored for a while, of course, though that was often so that the guard could loot everything not nailed down in peace, and eventually the guard would leave. After that, those pieces of the city would be left to rot. Squatters would move in sometimes, or gangs would use them to store illegal goods. In very rare cases, the lots were bought cheaply by merchants or nobles that would convert the cheap land into whatever they wanted. But because the record-keeping was so poor, that almost never happened, and many of the lots were simply lost. Dantes sent out his senses, feeling some growth, a few rats here and there, a stray dog, and a number of insects. Head passed a different seal block a while before, but it was newer, and he could tell just by looking at it that it was being used as a rent-free place to live by a number of people, so Head skipped over it. He needed something older and more overgrown. He knew of a few such places in Midtown, but those would need to be avoided. He looked around the deserted street he was on and climbed over the rotting wooden barrier and onto the other side. It was easy to tell why this section had been sealed off. The remnants of a massive building collapse were still evident. Only on the edges had a few smaller buildings survived. He walked the length of it up and down, sensing a colony of bats in the far corner and smiling. There are no signs of gang statues, squatters, or anything else. Low down south of the docks was mainly warehouses and factories, so that made sense. Found a spot toward the middle he thought would get good direct sunlight and pulled the pouch of seeds out his bag. He held each seed in his hand, reaching out to it as he decided where to place them. They each had their own preferences as to where they'd like to be. Some preferred a bit of shade, others wanted to be placed near one another, and still a few wanted to be as isolated as possible. He met each of their preferences as best he could, leading to a field about as far from neat rows of farmland as one could get. When he was done, he pulled out his dagger, testing the edge and thinking. He remembered how loud the calls for blood had been in his garden. They'd given him sleepless nights eventually, and only bodies full of blood could placate them. Had needed to give them blood in the damp dark of the pit, otherwise they wouldn't have grown. Here was a different story. There was sunlight, water, even surprisingly healthy soil. It was tempting to use blood to speed things along, but he decided against it, simply watering each seed carefully. The plants in his cave, where Head slept, had grown without blood, and still done so far faster than they should have. As long as he made time every day in the garden, he should have no issues helping it grow, and eventually Head have a new source of favor. He went to the edge of the block and reached out to the bats there. They were similar to the ones Head encountered in the pit, but different. He couldn't quite place why, but he figured Head find a way to draw moths to them and start building favor with them. He considered trying to speak with one, but decided against waking them. He walked back to the center of the space and placed his hand on the ground. He reached for those wispy threads that seemed to emanate from him and saw that they were already nearly anchored to the seeds. He focused on them, pushing them to be strong and to connect more firmly. They seemed to respond, and he opened his eyes, feeling their contentment. He stood back up and hopped back over the fence. He should arrive back at the Vixen just in time to be late for breakfast. "You're late for breakfast," said Vera from the head of the table, cutting into a heavily seasoned egg delicately with a knife and fork. "Sorry, Andy. Took a walk and got lost. Been a while since I've walked around the city." She raised an eyebrow. "You got lost?" "Fine. I'll be honest with you, I was starting a lovely little garden." There were some snickers at the table, but Vera just frowned. She could usually tell when he was lying. Had grown out of most of the tells Head had as a child, but she could usually feel it out by instinct. This time she felt like he was telling the truth, but knew he was lying. Dantes sat at the empty spot where Decker had been the previous day, next to Sarah, who was wearing an appropriately shit-eating grin for a girl her age at the mild scolding Head received. The bar was empty, and Dantes intended to simply sit and chat with the girls, but was surprised when Zilly emerged from the kitchen with a small plate of still warm food that she placed in front of him. She leaned close as she put it down. She smelled lightly of something floral he couldn't recognize. "Take good care of our girls today," she said firmly, before returning to her place behind the bar. Dantes nodded and tucked into his plate, drawing reprimanding looks from Vera and Sarah at his table manners. They definitely suffered from his time in the pit, but at least he was using utensils, though had to remind himself to use them before he dug in with his hands. That may have been Jacopo's appetite bleeding into him. He was still hungry in spite of eating half of the food Zilly had given them. When he was done, he excused himself and went up to his room. He hid a shiv in his sleeve, positioned his dagger to make it more visible, and tied back his unruly hair. He looked in the mirror. There was a roughness to him, and he was more muscular than he had been in the past, but he still was less intimidating than the average bouncer. If he was capable of growing a beard that may have made a difference, But unfortunately, his elven ancestry meant that didn't happen much. Though he could at least grow sideburns, likely thanks to that bit of dwarf he got from his mother. He let Jacopo out of his pocket and opened the window so that he could go on a walkabout. He broadcast some information about Midtown, specifically asking for him to scout around his old haunts while he was out and about. "If that's where my whims take me," responded Jacopo. Dantes smiled and pulled out a hunk of meat head saved from his plate, handing it to him. Jacopo nodded. "Looks like my whims take me to Midtown." He crawled out of the window and started back up the alley and into the slowly awakening city. He went back downstairs and helped Zilly move the breakfast table, rearrange the curtains, and adjust the low pink flames on the enchanted lanterns to turn the vixen vivacious. Once that was done, the girls all sat in various near-compromising positions, even having a small argument over who got to be on a particular lounging couch until Vera forced them into a compromise. Vera made a lot of stops, speaking at least a few moments to each girl. He heard snippets of advice as she walked and talked. "Don't reveal too much, dear. The clients still need to feel like they have to pay for something. The pouty lips worked for you a few years ago, but you may want to switch to a sultry smile instead. Don't wear the expensive leggings next time. Save those for yourself. A client is sure to rip them. Tyra, would it kill you to comb your hair? At this rate, well, need to shave you bald. If you spot this tale on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation." Dantes watched her as she worked. She had always been a mother hen, even when she was just another girl on the street. That was one of the reasons she and his actual mother had gotten along so well. It was clear that her care for the girls and attention to detail was what had so upgraded the vixen. He wondered how Shed managed to take it over Anne, who she was paying up to for protection. This area of the docks was nice, but all of the docks were controlled. It was possible she just tossed a bit of extra coin to the guard, but last time Dantes had been in the area, it was under the thumb of the dock sharks. That was 5 years ago, and it was hard to predict how the lay of the land may have shifted. He needed to gather information on where everything had gone since had been under. If he just focused on Midtown, he could miss something important. At least his job would allow him eavesdrop here and there. And as he rebuilt favor, he could begin to use rats and roaches to help him gather info when things were slow. "Dantes," said Vera, snapping him from his reverie. "Yes?" he asked. "Do you know the drill?" He nodded, had seen quite a bit of this kind of work in his lifetime. Stand around, look intimidating, watch for a signal from the girls if they need help. He looked around. "I'm guessing you have clientele restrictions?" Vera nodded. "We serve officers and their attendants. Regular sailors can come in if they look clean and seem like they have money. Same rule for other men off the street." Dantes nodded. He had always had an eye for who did and didn't have coin on them. Learned it from his mother, and had been able to recognize officers from boats thanks to his father. "2 extra rules for you." "Oh," asked Dantes. "Don't kill anyone, and don't spend all your time flirting with the girls. You could be a customer after Decker returns." He considered objecting, more because doing so was simply his dynamic with Vera than because he wasn't prone to doing either of those things. But she seemed focused on work, so all he said was, "Yes'm." She nodded and pointed at a gnome woman with big brown doe eyes and hips that, had she been human-sized, wouldn't have let her through a door. "Pris, you're at the door first. Your take last night was abysmal." She nodded with a bright smile and little indication she had taken offense at the comment, or that she had much going on in her head at all, then moved for the door. Dantes fell in behind her and headed for the door. "Dantes, go ahead and throw open the doors." He nodded and undid the massive latch before pushing it open. He hadn't expected a crowd so early, but to his surprise there were 4 men already there, waiting to enter. He gave them a quick up and down. All of them were 3rd or 4th mates in the Rendhold Merchant Navy, from what he could tell. Clean, 2 of them older, 2 of them younger. He motioned them in. Pris gave them a bubbly greeting, and almost immediately had a customer in one of the older men who ordered a drink for himself and her. Vera greeted all of them herself by name, clearly regulars, and then went up to her office to work on the books at novel been at. Alessa moved to Pris' place, giving Dantes a small smile as she leaned against the doorframe and adjusted her clothing. "Hope you have better luck today." "Me too. I don't want you to make a habit of taking pity on me." Dantes smiled. "I've had far worse habits." There was a tap on his shoulder, and he looked to see Vera there with a blank expression on her face. He sighed. I know, no flirting. She nodded and went back up the stairs where Head thought she was when he made the comment. How's your cough? He asked. I'm having a good day with it so far. Good. They stood there in comfortable silence for a while, until a few more customers trickled in and Alessa was lucky enough to get more work and swap places with Tyra. Tyra sat with her eyes half open watching the door and twirling her hair with no sign of boredom while they waited for another customer to walk in. Dantes could smell a faint scent of weed under her perfume and noted to himself that he should ask who her dealer was. If he was lucky, the weed that she bought was terrible and would be full of seeds and stems, and he could work on a special addition to his garden. Based on her expression and laid-back demeanor, though, he felt it was likely too good quality for that. When the door opened again, a man stepped inside. He was wearing kind of her vest and cuffs, long brown pants, and no shoes. His hair and beard were roughly tied back, and he had a distinctly thick and earthy odor to him. Peeking out from his vest was just a flash of tattoos, and his expression was one of disgust as he looked inside the vixen. Dantes immediately clocked him as someone with no money who was about to track dirt into the brothel. So he placed his hand in front of the man's chest. I think you're in the wrong place, he said, projecting confidence in spite of the man being easily a foot taller than him. The man smacked his hand away, and Dantes stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. The man looked at him with a face contorted into a scowl. He stepped forward and lifted Dantes by the shirt, raising a hand to strike him.